Chapter 173. Sir, I don't know what you asked. Why don't you ask the shopkeeper when she comes over later? Chu Qingning scratched his head and smiled embarrassedly. But there was a layer of cold sweat on his back. If Su Li didn't remind him, he almost found other excuses to dodge the question. But if he did that, it didn't conform to his identity as a waiter. The old woman's question seemed to be simple, but it was actually full of traps, which were impossible to guard against. Oh, I'm so stupid. Little brother, you can go to work. The fat proprietress said politely. She relaxed her vigilance slightly and let go of the shabby scholar's hand without a trace. Honey, be careful. The wine was almost spilled out. The shabby scholar complained pitifully and finally drank the first mouthful of wine as he wished. As soon as the spicy wine entered his throat and flowed through his stomach, a strong warmth rose. The shabby scholar sighed refreshingly. His eyes were hazy with drunkenness. It seemed that the wine didn't intoxicate him, but he was intoxicated. How many years had passed? Since he stepped into the inborn realm, it was difficult to drink the wine of the secular world. It was tasteless and unbearable. It was said that there was spiritual wine in the spiritual circle. Ordinary people in the secular world could prolong their life after drinking it. Warriors could not only enjoy it but also improve their cultivation. But that kind of spiritual wine was rare even in the spiritual circle. Even if he and his wife didn't follow the path of the secular world, they might not have the financial resources to buy it. Unexpectedly, in the 7th year of seclusion in Yunjing, he met a good wine that he could drink. He was a person who liked wine. Such a surprise was no less than finding a rare treasure. The proprietress sipped the Osmanthus wine and ate dishes at the same time. She was elegant and cheerful, which was completely opposite to her rough appearance. It could be seen that she liked the wine and dishes of the Linli building very much. They ate separately. They didn't communicate on the surface, but secretly transmitted the sound. Honey, do you see anything unusual? Honey, you can't see it. How can I see it? The shopkeeper is a young girl. She looks no more than 20 years old and has no cultivation. The waiter's expression is also very natural. It seems that there is nothing strange. You were worried in vain a few days ago. That's hard to say. If he really wanted to hide, he must have made thorough preparations. It's too early to make a conclusion. It was very strange for a luxurious winery to suddenly appear in a remote alley. The couple had been on guard for a long time. The scene this morning was just a show for them to investigate. However, when they came in and served the dishes, they didn't expect that they would be attracted by the dishes of the Linli building. Halfway through the meal, the shabby scholar puffed his cheeks and suddenly let out a sigh. He continued to transmit his voice, speaking of which, the wine in this shop is really delicious. The ones I brew can't even compare to the raging fire. If I can't drink the blazer wine in the future, I won't be able to live these days. The fat lady boss glared at the scholar and said, We really can't live like this. The wine you brew and the dishes I cook can't compare with the Linli building. If the winery's business fails, we'll all have to starve. You're still thinking about drinking? The shabby scholar was dumbfounded when he heard the words. His wife was right. Their winery and the Linli building were rivals in the same trade. The Juyu winery had been open for 7 years and had accumulated a lot of old customers. Once the Linli building opened, a group of old customers from rich families would definitely be attracted away. It was a big problem whether the Juyu winery could maintain its livelihood. The shabby scholar drank the wine one by one. The more he drank, the more worried he was. When he drank the last drop of wine in the cup, his face was full of sorrow. It was not easy for him to live incognito in Yunjing. He didn't want to fail in the last 3 years. In the next 3 years, he had to tighten his belt. Drinking? Don't even think about it. The fat lady boss was used to saving. After she cleaned up the dishes on the table, she got up and walked to the counter. She put down 10 taels of silver and said with a smile, It's just a small amount of money. It's nothing. The taels of silver can be a congratulatory gift for the opening of your new winery. I wish your winery a prosperous business. Yin Shuetong quickly got up and thanked her. Thank you for your kind words. I thank you on behalf of my master. The fat lady boss smiled and waved back. "Let's go, husband." The shabby scholar hurriedly got up and followed his wife to the door. He didn't forget to turn back and bow with hands folded in front. He behaved like a scholar. Su Li watched them leave, and a smile gradually appeared on her face. After eating her dishes, 10 taels of silver couldn't be paid back. In the previous life, when Xian Jingju was famous in Yunjing, she was still living a miserable life in the Su family. When she became a member of the martial arts circle, Xian Jingju had died. Although she didn't see how Xian Jingju showed his great power, she also heard a lot of information about him from her husband. In the battle for the throne in the previous life, all the princes formed cliques. In the end, the third prince was the most powerful one. The third prince was lucky enough to know the news about Xian Jingju. Then, he set up a trap to make Xian Jingju owe him a favor and work for him. The so-called favor was not a big deal. It was the same as in this life. Xian Jingju had to agree to the request of the third prince because of the drawbacks of the secular world. Later, the third prince failed in the battle for the throne, and Xian Jingju was also buried in Yunjing. According to her disabled husband, Xian Jingju had the intention to die in that battle, so he deliberately stayed behind. Finally, he died without a complete body and reunited with his wife who was already in the underworld. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly. She didn't hear her husband mention how the fat lady boss died in the previous life. Today, she saw her real body and found that the cultivation of the proprietress was even higher than that of Xian Jingju. One was in the inborn 8th hurdle, and the other was in the inborn 9th hurdle. The couple was also legendary in the martial arts circle, but they died inexplicably in the previous life. It could be seen how deep and muddy the water was in the battle for the throne. In this life, she had managed to recruit the Xian couple before anyone else, breaking the third prince's wings and strengthening her own strength. However, she also knew that it was far from enough for her to do well in the battle for the throne with just this little bit of foundation she had. Su Li sat in the Linli building for a whole afternoon. More than a dozen drinkers were attracted by the fragrance of the wine, but most of them were scared away by the horrible price. Only 2 rich guests ordered a pot of third-class Liehua spirits. After drinking, they ordered a whole jar of second-class Liehua spirits to take away, so that the Linli building would have a profit. Tut-tut, the revenue is only 2 or 3,000 taels a day. It is less than that of the Qinghe province. In the deserted restaurant, Chu Qingning lay beside Yin Shuatong and looked at the account. He couldn't help but sigh. Although he knew that the main purpose of Su Li to open the Linli building was not to make money, it was a little uncomfortable to earn so little in a day. In order to build the restaurant before, they spent more than 600,000 taels of silver. How many days would it take to earn back the cost? Yin Shuatong rolled her eyes and said, "You should be content. The road to Yunjing has just been paved. I believe that Su Li will definitely do business in the future. You are impetuous. You should learn from Brother Fang and practice hard. He is 1 year older than you, but he has reached the inborn realm. You are only in the acquired 9th hurdle. Don't you feel ashamed?" Chu Qingning scratched his head and said bitterly, "Sister, it is wrong for you to say so. No one can compare with that madman. Fang Yuan is crazier than before. It is shameful for me to reach the acquired 9th hurdle at this age. 90% of the young talents in the world are too ashamed to see others." Yin Shuatong snorted and said in a low voice, "I only know that someone is more and more lazy these days. Be careful that Fang Mu will surpass you one day." Chu Qingning smiled embarrassedly and quickly promised that he would not do it in the future. He said, "Don't tell Su Li about it. Otherwise, I don't know how she will punish me." Yin Shuatong said meaningfully and looked back. Chu Qingning was immediately scared and broke into a cold sweat. He suddenly turned back but did not see anyone. He breathed a sigh of relief and said angrily, "Shuatong." Yin Shuatong covered her mouth and snickered. Chu Qingning subconsciously looked up and saw Su Li sitting next to the escalator above their head. His anger immediately turned into horror. "Chu Qingning, since you like to sleep, I have recently developed an elixir that can help you practice while sleeping. Why don't you try it?" Su Li raised her eyebrows and asked in a low voice. Although she asked for his opinion, her tone was indisputable. Chu Qingning felt bitter. He knew that he had no right to refuse. Su Li walked down the stairs slowly. When she came over, she bent over and glanced at today's account. Then she turned around and patted Chu Qingning on the shoulder. She said, "Chu Qingning, if you practiced like this in the Chu family 2 years ago, it was really hard and fast. But I can't." Su Li's tone gradually became cold. She said, "In the future, there will be few enemies below the inborn realm. If you continue to be so lazy, you can only retire from the main force and manage the accounts in the Leanly building. You will never have a chance to fight. If you can live an ignoble life and give your fate to others, you can continue to live like this. In the future, I won't say anything about you." Chu Qingning's expression changed. Finally, he stopped smiling. At this moment, he realized the seriousness of the situation. Su Li's words were not a warning, but a final notice. After he came to Yunjing, he was really lazy. Yin Shuatong stopped keeping accounts and looked back at Chu Qingning firmly. She believed that Chu Qingning could make the right decision. Although Chu Qingning was a little jumpy, if he was serious, he was no worse than anyone else. What he lacked was motivation. Su Li approached Chu Qingning and sneered, "Think about the hatred of your Chu family. Do you want Fang Yuan and Yin Shuatong to avenge you?" Chu Qingning was suddenly shocked and felt ashamed. He said, "I was wrong." Su Li stopped lecturing and nodded slightly. Chu Qingning was not like Fang Yuan. Fang Yuan was more persistent. He had been practicing hard all the time. His cultivation progress was no less than hers. Chu Qingning was with a beauty, but revenge was far away. He was not as mature as Yin Shuatong or Fang Yuan. He needed her to remind him from time to time so that his talent would not be wasted. Today is the Mid-Autumn Festival. It is rare to see a lantern show on the East Street. Take Shuatong to have a look." Su Li said slowly. Yin Shuatong's ears turned red and she turned her head away. Tap, 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 Fang Yuan came downstairs. It seemed that he had just finished a period of practice. He fixed his eyes on Su Li, and there was an extremely obscure expectation in his eyes. Feeling the former's gaze, Su Li turned her head and looked at him. She was stunned for a moment and then moved her eyes away without a trace. She said, "I will go back to the Su house first, in case of any flaws." Then, she left in a hurry before the 3 people responded. When the beauty went away, Fang Yuan pursed his lips and a deep sense of loss flashed in his eyes. Chu Qingning forced a smile and asked, "Fang Yuan, why don't we go to the lantern show?" Chapter 174. It was evening when Su Li returned to the Su house. Li Yuelian and Su Huanli were busy. The Su house finally had a festive atmosphere. However, Su Zipei and Zhu Yang were not there. The old lady was also obsessed with worshipping Buddha and didn't go out. The Su house seemed quite deserted after the servants left. "Miss, you are back." Mammy Li quickly handed a towel to Su Li to wipe her face. The servants and maids behind her immediately shouted in unison, "Hello, second miss. Hello, second miss." Su Li had never seen these servants before. She couldn't help but ask, "Mammy, they?" Mammy Li understood and quickly pulled Su Li to the door. She said, "Miss, the first master came back during the day. These servants were all brought back by him." Su Li's eyes flashed. She didn't ask more, but she was secretly vigilant. The eldest brother clearly said that the Su house didn't need many servants to avoid wasting money. Why did he suddenly change his mind? Where is the eldest brother? I'll go to see him. In the study. It seems that he is discussing with the master about the reopening of the Baiwei building. Su Li handed back the wet towel and turned to Su Qingtan's study. The Su house was not so big. After a while, Su Li appeared outside the study. But she was stopped by Su Qingtan's personal maid, Zhu Er. She raised her chin and said, "The young master said that no one can go in and disturb him except the master." Su Li was stunned. What surprised her was not Su Qingtan's order, but Zhu Er. It was clear that Zhu Er had raped her. She could even smell the faint smell of blood. It was what happened today. The first master came back during the day. Thinking of what Mammy Li said before, Su Li frowned. Was it done by the eldest brother? Zhua stayed with the eldest brother for 10 years. She couldn't believe that the eldest brother would be so eager for sex that he couldn't wait for the evening. Su Li was not stupid enough to ask Zhua directly. She retreated to the side of the courtyard door and quietly poured her psychic awareness into the study. Soon, the scene in the study appeared in her psychic awareness. Su Huanli and Su Qingtan sat at the table and talked about the Baiwei building. Su Qingtan seemed to be normal, but Su Li felt strange. If the impression that her big brother gave her before was that of a righteous, humble, and courteous gentleman, the impression he gave her now was that of a flamboyant madman. An aura brimming with confidence emanated from within. The sense of inferiority he felt because of his cultivation was gone. Su Li looked gloomy. What did Ling Qinglan do to him? In her mind, her psychic awareness condensed into a thread and was about to penetrate into Su Qingtan's body to investigate. But at the moment when she was about to enter, she stopped. She suddenly found that the Niwen Palace between Su Qingtan's eyebrows was set up by someone. If the innate psychic awareness wanted to explore the human body, the most convenient way was through contact. But for Su Li's long-distance exploration, she could only take the risk of entering from the acupuncture point between the eyebrows, the Niwen Palace. As long as the perception of the Niwen Palace was shielded, she could explore the latter's internal situation without being noticed. If the latter's soul force was higher than that of the scout's spiritual sense would be devoured by his Niwen Palace, and he would be heavily injured. Therefore, the inborn seniors would never use this method to explore. There was also a kind of person who was born with a strong soul force, and some of them were even stronger than the warriors of the inborn hurdle. Therefore, it was not without risks for the warriors of the inborn hurdle to explore the Niwen Palace of the warriors of the acquired hurdle or ordinary people. Su Li slowly withdrew her psychic awareness. There was hesitation in her eyes. She was calculating the gains and losses. The inhibition in Su Qingtan's Niwen Palace was not harmful, but a warning from the warrior of the inborn hurdle. It proved that the warrior of the inborn hurdle was under his protection. Undoubtedly, the warrior of the inborn hurdle could only be Ling Qinglan. If she rashly touched the inhibition set by Ling Qinglan was likely to find her. She was not sure that she would not leave a trace of pneuma after touching the inhibition. If Su Qingtan noticed it, she would be exposed. More importantly, although Su Qingtan tried his best to restrain the leakage of pneuma, Su Li still found that his current cultivation was as high as the acquired 6th hurdle. Moreover, it was growing stronger at an extremely strange speed. She was happy to see that her eldest brother's strength became stronger. She was not sure whether it would affect Su Qingtan's cultivation after touching the inhibition. But she was also worried about whether the secret method of rapid cultivation would cause unpredictable harm to her eldest brother. When Su Li was still struggling, the door suddenly opened with a squeak. Su Li raised her head and saw her Su Huanli coming out with a relaxed face. Su Qingtan stood at the door to see him off and said with a smile, "I have already told the officer of the Supreme Judiciary. The Baiwei building will be unsealed soon. Dad, you can rest assured." "That's great." Su Huanli laughed. When he looked back and saw Su Li standing at the door of the courtyard, he was stunned and asked, "Li, when did you come back? Why don't you come in?" Su Li moved her lips. Before she said anything, Su Qingtan said with a smile, "Dad, I told you not to let the second sister come in. I will take care of the business of the Su family in the future. Isn't it good for the second sister to enjoy her happiness?" Su Huanli was stunned. He seemed to doubt whether the words came from his eldest son. Su Qingtan had told him more than once that he would give at least half of the income of the Baiwei building to Su Li. Why did he change his temper today? Could it be that he was enlightened? Thinking of this, Su Huanli was happy and quickly agreed, "Yes, yes, yes. Besides, Li, you are old enough to get married. There are many rich and powerful families in Yunjing City." "Dad." Su Qingtan's face changed slightly and he interrupted his eldest son loudly. Su Huanli was stunned. Just now, his eldest son seemed to be angry. He just told the truth. Why was his son angry? "Eldest brother?" Su Li said with doubt. The soft tone fell into Su Qingtan's eyes and immediately made his eyes pink. His lower body also had the tendency to swell. But in an instant, his pink turned into ice blue. It seemed that his whole body was poured by ice water and he had no desire for half a year. Su Li frowned subtly. Her eldest brother's situation was very strange. Dad, let's not talk about the second sister for the time being. Let's solve the business of the Baiwei building first. Su Qingtan found a reasonable reason. Su Huanli felt it was reasonable and said, then I will go to work. You haven't slept recently because of your family. Have a good rest. I will ask your mother to call you out for a reunion dinner in the evening. Su Qingtan said It seemed that he couldn't make a look except indifference. He turned his head and looked at Su Li. There was only coldness in his eyes without any warmth. He said, second sister, you also go to help. I am tired today. Zhu was happy when she heard that. She immediately stood up and pushed Su Li to go out. She whispered in Su Li's ear, get out of here. Don't you see that the first master doesn't want to see you at all? Su Li bit her lower lip and glanced at Su Qingtan with grievance. Finally, she left silently. Zhu was more complacent when she saw that. It seemed that she had won a big battle. She was already the young master's woman. Even if she was not good enough, she could become a concubine. At that time, she would be Su Li's elder. She was so complacent that she immediately forgot her manners. She thought that her voice was low enough, but Su Qingtan was now a master of the Hutian 6th stage, so he naturally heard every word. Anger flashed in his heart, and his pupils flashed with red light. He said in an unquestionable voice, Zhu, come in. Zhu was startled by the sudden angry shout. She looked back and saw Su Qingtan's back entering the room. She was shy, but she still went in obediently. After a repressed gasp, the red light in Su Qingtan's eyes receded. He straightened his clothes and got out of bed. He was in a daze and finally showed regret. Su Qingtan smiled bitterly in his heart. He got up and walked to the window of the study. He didn't regret becoming a member of the Enmore cult or practicing such a weird Shengong. The only thing he regretted was that he didn't listen to Ling Qinglan's words. He didn't go out after the lust. He was afraid that Su Li would be worried and forced to go out in advance. He thought that there would be no mistake with the cold air given by Ling Qinglan. But as soon as he came back, he made an irreparable mistake. Just seeing her, I used 3 masses of cold air to barely suppress the lust in my body. The reunion dinner. I can't go. Making up his mind, Su Qingtan took the clothes and the long sword hanging on the wall and left without looking back. He said, Zhu, tell my father that there is an urgent matter to deal with in the Supreme Judiciary. I won't go for dinner. Ah! Zhu was still secretly happy in the quilt. She suddenly heard Su Qingtan's voice. She immediately popped out her head in surprise and said, Master, you won't even have the reunion dinner? While she was talking, Su Qingtan was gone. In the Supreme Judiciary. Su Qingtan slowly walked to the study. The door of the study suddenly opened silently. Ling Qinglan leaned against the door with a smile and said lightly, You know that you are back? Su Qingtan forced himself to nod. Ling Qinglan sniffed and said, I advised you at that time that it was not the time for you to come out. I didn't even go back to the Ling mansion for you. But you. Fortunately, the Qiyu Shengong doesn't require a virgin body, otherwise. Su Qingtan's blood froze. He bowed and said in a low voice, I know I was wrong. Hearing Su Qingtan's words, Ling Qinglan finally stopped smiling and said coldly, Remember, since the moment you entered the Enmore cult, your life is not yours anymore. No matter what I say in the future, you can't resist at all. I train you as my successor. One day, you will take over my position. Don't let me lose face in front of the hierarch. Su Qingtan nodded in a muffled voice, but he didn't think so in his heart. Ling Qinglan was clearly an inborn senior with a very long life. He didn't even know whether he could break through the inborn realm. Maybe Ling Qinglan was still alive when he died. Take over his position? That was really a fantasy. He never thought about usurping the throne. After all, as long as he passed through the dangerous period of the Qiyu Shengong, he could become more powerful. At that time, he could control his desire and protect his second sister better. Chapter 175. Following Ling Qinglan into the study, Su Qingtan couldn't help but be stunned. Why did the study return to its original state? Qiyu Shengong was undoubtedly a real evil martial art. Su Qingtan practiced it well, and there were many inner demons. Ling Qinglan used extreme cold to suppress the inner demons in his body. The whole study was like a cold place in the north winter. The surface was covered with a layer of frost. In the past 10 days, Su Qingtan was frozen all over, but he also passed the first stage of Qiyu Shengong safely. He woke up from the muddlehead state and was no longer completely dominated by the 7 emotions and 6 desires. Even Ling Qinglan was surprised by such a change. He thought that Su Qingtan would wake up at least a month with his willpower. He didn't expect that Su Qingtan only took 1/3 of the time. Now the inner demons in your body are stabilized. I don't have to stay with you all the time. Ling Qinglan walked to the wall and opened the stone door. An amazing cold air came and instantly froze the wall near the stone door. But it stopped at a strange black line and couldn't spread any further. When you go back, I change a place for you. This is the adytum where I usually practice. You will stay here until you completely master Qiyu Shengong. Su Qingtan couldn't help but shiver. When he was muddlehead, it didn't matter how cold the environment was. But now he was sober. Go ahead. After this stage, you will have the opportunity to master a stronger power. Ling Qinglan's eyes were calm. Whether you are a dragon or a worm depends on your performance. Su Qingtan took a deep breath and stepped into the room. Su Qingtan smiled and pressed the mechanism. The stone door began to close slowly. At the same time, he didn't forget to remind him again, don't stop running Shengong at any time. Otherwise, the cold poison will enter your body. I can't save you. Okay. Boom. The stone door was completely closed, and the adytum fell into darkness. There was only a little light above his head. Su Qingtan sat on the cold stone surface. His eyebrows and hair were covered with a layer of frost at a speed visible to the naked eye. The floating inner demons were also completely suppressed. Su Qingtan's eyes flashed coldly. He slowly closed his eyes and became silent. Once he succeeded, no one would be able to bully second sister anymore. After closing the stone door, Ling Qinglan was slightly relieved. He thought highly of Su Qingtan, but he didn't have confidence before he gave him Qiyu Shengong. Fortunately, Su Qingtan had a good temperament. In other words, his obsession was strong enough to let him pass the first test of Qiyu mysterious art. After checking the black lines on the stone door again and confirming that there was no damage, he waved his hand and the bookcase flew over to block the stone door. His heart was filled with sadness. The plan was finally on track. I didn't expect that it would feel good to make arrangements for my funeral. Ling Qinglan muttered to himself and turned around. His pupils shrank instantly. Not far behind him, a green-robed youth holding a folding fan had appeared out of nowhere. The youth was looking at him with a mocking expression. He didn't even notice when this person had arrived. Did he see everything about Su Qingtan? The thought flashed in Ling Qinglan's mind, and there was a slight killing intention in his eyes. The time was not ripe. The thing about Su Qingtan must not be exposed. The young man in cyan didn't seem to notice Ling Qinglan's killing intent. Instead, he walked slowly to the table and sat down as if he was back home. He crossed his legs and said lazily, "Take it easy, Ling Qinglan. I don't want to fight with you. What's more, you are not my opponent. Why do you fight with me?" The voice of the young man was extremely strange. It sounded like a man and a woman. Coupled with the tough face of the young man in cyan, it was extremely incongruous. Ling Qinglan was stunned when he heard the voice. Then he quickly recalled the owner of the voice and blurted out, "Mr. Li?" Su Li chuckled and held out her hands. "Lord Ling, we haven't seen each other for a long time. How are you?" The person was Su Li who followed Su Qingtan. At this moment, she changed her appearance to that of when she met Chu Lu. If she wanted the Linli building to be fully established in Yunjing, the identity of Mr. Li would be exposed sooner or later. In this case, it was better to take the initiative to see him. Ling Qinglan restrained his killing intention and straightened up. He still didn't relax his vigilance and said, "Mr. Li, You come here late at night. Is it a trivial matter? At the same time, Ling Qinglan was also shocked in his heart. Mr. Li turned out to be a young man. Was he a young master like Ling Li? He remembered that in Qinghe province, Mr. Li, whom he had never met, said little girl, but he was a young man. He couldn't help but have goosebumps. Mr. Li's hobbies were too weird. Su Li waved her hand and chuckled. Lord Ling, you are wrong. Soon after I arrived in Yunjing, I saw an acquaintance sneaking at night. I couldn't help but be curious, so I came to have a look. I didn't expect to see Lord Ling's elegant demeanor. It's really unexpected. Ling Qinglan heard the words, but he didn't relax at all. He said, Mr. Li, don't beat around the bush. If you want something, just say it. Su Li patted the folding fan and made a light sound. She said, Lord Ling, you are really straightforward. I want to ask, what is the Qiyu Shengong? Can you lend it to me to have a look? He was there from the very beginning. Ling Qinglan's heart sank slightly. He said coldly, Your Excellency, you want to borrow the Shengong encyclopedia. Isn't it too rude? Su Li said, Oh. She turned her head and suddenly said, Lord Ling, I am really a little abrupt. Then I will put it in another way. You hide the Qiyu Shengong from the hierarch of the Enmore cult and secretly let Su Qingtan practice. Can you let me have a look? In the end, Su Li's tone was cold. It was a naked threat. Ling Qinglan was slightly shocked and his face gradually became gloomy. If he didn't give it to Su Li, the plan would be ruined if Su Li told Ling Li about it. But the Qiyu Shengong was the treasure of the Enmore cult. How could he show it to outsiders? Mr. Li was still the same as before. He seemed to know everything, mysterious and weird. How about it? Sir Ling, this little brother doesn't have much time. If Sir Ling really feels that it's too difficult, then this little brother can only trouble himself to make another trip to the Ling residence. Hearing the faint voice, Ling Qinglan was helpless. He took out the ancient book from his arms and threw it over. Su Li's eyes were slightly bright. She reached out to catch it. But at the moment when she touched the ancient book, she caught a glimpse of Ling Qinglan's burning eyes. She immediately withdrew her hand like lightning and let the ancient book fall to the ground. She didn't catch it. Ling Qinglan's heart sank. He underestimated Su Li's caution. Mr. Li, you don't even have the courage. Facing Ling Qinglan's sarcasm, Su Li smiled slightly and picked up the ancient book through her sleeves. She said, It is better to be safe than sorry. I haven't reached the point where I can defeat thousands of people. What's more, Lord Ling has been sick for a long time. Maybe you have a good attainment in the poison circle. While talking, Su Li had glanced at the general principle of the ancient book. It was indeed the Qiyu Shengong. She came suddenly, so Ling Qinglan didn't have a chance to prepare a fake one. Shengong, high grade. It was an evil martial art. This martial art was guided by the 7 emotions and 6 desires to reach the inborn realm. If the negative effects were ignored, it could indeed be called an extraordinary martial art that could quickly practice to the inborn realm. 7 emotions and 6 desires, 7 emotions and 6 desires. No wonder the eldest brother became like that, Su Li said in her heart. The general principle clearly stated that if one couldn't keep his mind, he would lose his mind and become a madman dominated by desires while practicing this martial art. But the eldest brother had practiced this martial art for several days, and he didn't become like that. In addition, what she saw just now, she instantly guessed that Ling Qinglan used the ice poison to suppress Su Qingtan's inner demons. But the ice poison in Ling Qinglan's body had accumulated for many years, and it was uncontrollable. If he used it rashly, it would inevitably aggravate the ice poison. Thinking of this, Su Li raised her head strangely. His face was ruddy as usual. Did Ling Qinglan find a way to control the ice poison? Ling Qinglan was quite uncomfortable under Su Li's gaze. He was worried in his heart. His medical attainment was widely known in the Qinghe province. If he saw the general principle of Shengong, he would definitely infer a lot of things. If Mr. Li found that he used external forces to suppress the ice poison, it would be very bad. In fact, he couldn't fight with others at all. Every time he fought, he consumed his vitality. If he fought many times, It was uncertain whether he could help Ling Li get the full moon and heartstrings at the end of the year. Crack. Su Li put the ancient book on the table, stood up and walked to the door. She gave a fist and palm salute and said with a smile, "Lord Ling, thank you for satisfying my curiosity. It's late at night, so I have to leave now. See you later." After that, Su Li simply disappeared outside the door before Ling Qinglan responded. She came here because she was worried about the eldest brother. It could be seen that Su Qingtan practiced this martial art voluntarily, and he was not forced by Ling Qinglan. Of course, she couldn't persuade the eldest brother to give up. If Ling Qinglan stayed, the eldest brother would definitely not be in great danger. She was a little relieved and went back to the Su house. Thinking that she came out rashly and didn't make up a suitable reason for Su Huanli, she felt a slight headache. Seeing the figure of the young man in cyan disappear outside the door, Ling Qinglan was stunned. He left after reading the ancient book. Did he really come to satisfy his curiosity? It was dark when Su Li returned to the Su house. Mammy Li waited in the yard as usual, like an old mother who was waiting for her daughter to come home. Seeing Su Li coming back, Mammy Li was happy and immediately greeted her. "Miss, haven't you eaten? I've prepared a midnight snack for you." Su Li said and handed the cyan clothes to Mammy Li. She asked, "Where are father and others?" Mammy Li was a little embarrassed when she heard the words. She hesitated for a moment and then replied, "Master and others didn't send someone to invite you to have a reunion dinner." Su Li was slightly stunned and immediately felt relieved. Her original position in the family was no different from that of a maid. This cognition was deeply rooted in the hearts of the Su family. In the past, they were just kind to her because of Su Qingtan. But the attitude of the eldest brother during the day undoubtedly gave a message to Su Huanli, that was, Su Li was out of favor. How could a maid who was out of favor be qualified to have a reunion dinner? Su Li shook her head and laughed. Su Li, did you still have illusions about the Su family? Why didn't you see this clearly? Chapter 176. Time passed day by day. Su Li went to the affiliated school of the National Academy to practice as usual. But every day when she came back, she would wait for a while in front of the door to see if the eldest brother would come back at night. After visiting the Supreme Judiciary at night, she understood Su Qingtan's difficulties. As long as she got through the negative phase of Qiyu Shengong, the familiar eldest brother would come back. However, it didn't mean that the Su family also knew it. At first, with the deterrence of Su Qingtan, peace was maintained in the Su house. But after Zhu Yang recovered, Su Huanli immediately cut off Su Li's allowance. Nobody knew what Zhu Yang said to Su Huanli. "Miss, the third miss has been very close to several rich masters recently." The old master was very happy when he heard that. He doubled the monthly allowance for the third miss. Mammy Li told Su Li what she heard from the maid. In Yunjing City, Mammy Li didn't have the power to ask for the news. Li Yuelian managed the housework in the past few months. Although the servants she hired were not very good, they were not as evil as Mammy Zheng. Mammy Li told Su Li that Mammy Li was a servant of Li Yuelian. Obviously, the Zhu family couldn't extend their influence to Yunjing City. "I see," Mammy Li. Su Li nodded and smiled helplessly. She said, "It doesn't matter. I still have the monthly allowance of the affiliated school. It is enough for living expenses. Mammy Li, you also pack up and live with me in the affiliated school." Zhu Yang had been lying for more than a month. She was very angry. If Mammy Li stayed in the Su house alone, she would be worried. The affiliated school of the National Academy was her territory. No matter how Zhu Yang made trouble, Su Huanli thought that she was not allowed to lose face in the National Academy. Thinking of this, Su Li suddenly froze and then became silent. She was not the person who could give up and betray everything in her previous life. Everything had changed. "Oh," Miss Mammy Li answered and went to pack up. She didn't find Su Li's abnormality. It was not the first time that Mammy Li moved out of the Su house. Mammy Li seemed to be familiar with it. She didn't worry much. The miss was not the weak girl who couldn't protect herself before. Instead, she became mysterious and powerful. As long as she served the miss, She was not afraid of anything. Su Li's luggage was as light as before. There were only 2 boxes, and they were quickly moved to the carriage. Except for a few expensive dresses that Su Qingtan bought for her, the rest were plain clothes, and there were few jewelry, just like before. Mammy Li came to the affiliated school and saw the crooked plaque. Mammy Li carefully carried the box and followed Su Li in. Seeing Su Li's relaxed expression, she couldn't help but sigh secretly. Compared with the Su house, it was more like the home of the Miss. The National Academy was rich and overbearing. Although it was robbed before, and the things in the affiliated school were all moved away, when Su Li reported the situation, they rearranged new furniture for her the next day. They arranged it according to Su Li's own ideas, and it was much more comfortable to live in. Mammy, there is no place to cook in the affiliated school. When it's time to eat, you can take the food box to the canteen of the National Academy. It's just that the National Academy only provides 1 meal. You have to figure out a way sooner or later. Su Li informed Mammy Li. Mammy Li smiled and said, "Miss, don't worry. It's not a big deal for me to rent a kitchen nearby. It doesn't cost much." Su Li nodded and gave the identity jade token to Mammy Li. She said, "Go to get your monthly salary." Mammy Li took it and went out immediately. It was almost evening. She had to finish the things that the Miss ordered and then prepare the dinner. As a matter of fact, she had been a lecturer of the affiliated school for more than 3 months. She had been practicing in the Aditum all the time and never got her salary. According to the consumption level of Yunjing City, Mammy Li should get a few hundred taels of silver. Thinking of this, Su Li shook her head and smiled. It didn't matter if she didn't eat. But her identity was only in the acquired 8th hurdle. She had to pretend to eat. After a while, Mammy Li came back with a gloomy face. She held the jade token tightly in her hand and didn't speak for a long time. Su Li frowned and asked, "What's wrong, Mammy?" Alas, Mammy Li sighed and put the jade token on the table. She said sadly, "Miss, the National Academy said that your salary was taken away 2 days ago. It seems to be." The third Miss Su Li raised her eyebrows and didn't speak. Mammy Li added, "The administrator said that according to the rules of the National Academy, you must see the jade token to get the salary." But the third Miss pestered endlessly. It was really a headache. In addition, the third Miss showed her face in the previous case. Her identity couldn't be fake. The administrator couldn't stand it anymore and gave her the salary. It was 2,000 taels of silver. If it fell into the hands of the first madam, it must be. She couldn't get it back at all. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly. Zhu Yang obviously blocked her way of living premeditatedly. The Su house gave the regular salary in the middle of every month. It was just a few days after the middle of the month. If she didn't have other income, she should be short of money now. Su Li smiled slightly and took out a note of 1,000 taels of silver from her arms. She handed it to Mammy Li. When Mammy Li saw the note, her eyes suddenly widened. She stammered and asked, Miss, where did the money come from? Don't be confused. Of course, the winery earned it. Su Li explained softly, but the Linli building can't be known by our family. So, please put on a play for the note. When Mammy Li heard the Linli building, it suddenly dawned on her. She almost forgot that the Miss had another property. But now they were far away in Yunjing City. How did the Miss get the money of the winery? Did she hide it with her all the time? Mammy Li felt strange. She washed clothes for the Miss every day, but she didn't see the note. Miss, how should we put on a play? Even if you let me sell in a brothel, I can't make so much money in one night. Su Li almost spat out the tea. She said, just pick it up on the road. Mammy Li blushed and nodded shyly. Later, under the guidance of Su Li, Mammy Li chose a place where there were not many people and pretended to pick up the note. Although her acting was very exaggerated, no one paid attention to her because of the money. The news of picking up something cheap always spread far. What's more, Zhu Yang paid attention to Su Li's situation all the time. When Zhu Yang heard the news, she almost collapsed with anger. This damned girl, is she really my nemesis? Zhu Yang gasped and her face was livid. She deliberately planned for many days and came up with a way to cut off the money and food for Su Li when Su Qingtan was away. Although Su Li wouldn't starve to death, she would be so hungry that she would lose her face. In this way, the chance that Su Li's father found her was much smaller and they would be safe. But God let the wicked girl pick up 1,000 taels of silver. It was equivalent to 4 months' money. Su Qingtan should come back after 4 months. Zhu Yang was not as stupid as Su Huanli. Su Qingtan's love for Su Li would not change easily. Although she didn't know why Su Qingtan pretended to be indifferent, she was sure that this attitude would not last for a long time. Zhu Yang was anxious. During the 3 months when she was lying in bed, she didn't stop thinking all the time. However, her little ability couldn't be used in Yunjing. If the mysterious woman didn't appear, Zipei wouldn't be able to hook up with so many rich families to inquire about the news. No. I must let Zipei find the owner of the jade pendant as soon as possible. Otherwise, the longer I delay, the smaller the chance will be. Su Li's social circle was gradually expanding. Zhu Yang was not sure whether Su Li looked like her parents. If she looked like her parents, maybe she would be recognized in the autumn hunting contest tomorrow. She really didn't have much time. Zhu Yang could only pray that Su Li stayed in the affiliated school and played with the medicine pots. She didn't go to the autumn hunting contest. The next morning, Su Li woke up from meditation. Mammy Li carefully took care of her for breakfast. Then she quickly changed into casual clothes and went out. She didn't forget the autumn hunting contest today. A few days ago, Tang Lei specially came to the affiliated school. Although he was a little afraid that Su Li fed him medicine and made him suffer from diarrhea, he was much better than before. Even if he ran across a street, he wouldn't feel breathless. He was grateful. Therefore, he specially came to Su Li and told her about the autumn hunting contest. After the Mid-Autumn Festival every year, the Dahan country would hold a grand autumn hunting contest. It was not only to symbolize the harvest season, but also to test the martial arts ability of the younger generation. The autumn hunting contest was the time when many unknown students of the martial arts school became famous. The talents who gained the most in the autumn hunting contest would receive a lot of rewards from the royal family. They even had the opportunity to enter the imperial palace to meet the emperor. The rewards here were not ordinary ones. They might be magic weapons, Shengong secret skills that were hard to get, or secret treasures that were hard to see in the martial arts circle. In short, if a poor disciple wanted to make a great leap, today was an excellent opportunity. Su Li walked to the main gate of the National Academy and heard a lot of voices. Su Li saw rows of carriages leaving from the gate of the National Academy. There were also many poor disciples walking there. The age limit of the autumn hunting contest was 22 years old. The young talents whose cultivation was above the acquired 5th hurdle were the most in the National Academy. Speaking of this, Ling Ping is only 21 years old this year. His cultivation is in the inborn 1st hurdle, Su Li murmured. She couldn't help but feel strange. How could these poor people be the opponents of Ling Ping who had experienced hundreds of battles? This year's rewards were almost given to Ling Ping. When Su Li was thinking, she suddenly heard someone calling her name. She turned her head and saw Tang Lei poking his head out of the carriage and waving to her. According to Tang Lei, the autumn hunting contest was not very safe. Even if you just watched from the periphery, you might be accidentally injured. Therefore, it was better not to act alone, especially for a weak woman like Su Li. Therefore, Tang Lei kindly invited her to go with him. Su Li gladly accepted Tang Lei's proposal. She hadn't seen the famous Prime Minister Tang yet. It was a good opportunity to get in touch with him. Chapter 177. The spacious carriage was full at this moment. The one sitting in the middle was not Prime Minister Zhuo as Su Li imagined, but a kind old lady with silver hair. Although the old lady's face was full of wrinkles and even senile spots, her face had been painted into portraits and spread in the streets of Dahan country. She was the legend of Dahan country, Jiyu Yang of the Ling Mansion, Mrs. Jiyu. Su Li knew that the young lady sitting on the right side of Mrs. Jiyu was Ling Li's mother, Mrs. Chiu Meng. On the left side was General Ling Ping. Then Ling Li and Ling Qinglan sat on both sides respectively. Then Tang Lei sat next to Ling Qinglan. Su Li didn't know whether it was intentional or unintentional, but the last empty seat was next to Ling Li. This family, which was enough to shock the upper circle of Yunjing City, would specially go to the National Academy to pick her up. It seemed that Tang Lei couldn't make the decision. Even in the face of the emperor, even if the sky fell down, she would never be distracted. But when she saw the people of the Ling mansion, she unconsciously clenched her hands in her sleeves. Only she knew why she was so nervous. Greetings, old lady, Madam Meng, General Ling. Mrs. Ji was also looking at Su Li. Seeing Su Li saluting, she still smiled, but she was not very satisfied. Su Li seemed to be too nervous and a little narrow-minded. But the Su family was a puny family after all. It was understandable. Mother, you are the legend of Dahan country. Su Li has never seen you before. She is nervous when we meet for the first time. It's useless to look at her with the eyes of a granddaughter-in-law. Ling Li is a good-for-nothing. Su Li may not be willing to marry him. Qiu Meng covered her mouth and transmitted the sound. Mrs. Ji knew it made sense. But of her two grandsons, one was fighting outside all day and didn't want to get married, and the other wanted to get married but no girl was willing to marry him. She was so anxious that she didn't know when she could have a great-grandson. She saw Su Li today. Su Li was beautiful, clean, gentle and polite. She was also a lecturer of the affiliated school who was proficient in medical skills. Su Li was a good girl. More importantly, Ling Li liked her. How could she bear it? The communication was only for a moment. Mrs. Ji thought clearly and sighed in her heart. She quickly asked Su Li to sit down and said kindly, "Don't be nervous. I'm not a man-eating tiger. I heard it from the boy of the Tang family. I am curious about the appearance of the talented girl in Yunjing City, so I come to see." Su Li sat next to Ling Li uncomfortably and said modestly, "You flatter me, old lady. I'm still far behind you." Ha ha ha. Ms. Ji laughed heartily. "You little girl, the war is not as tense as before. Ping won every battle." "Ling ping ping," Ping Ji said. Minister Li smiled and said, "Ji I said family, Li said, I Ling said, Ji minister. Ling Ji is, Ping, and King is, Li minister Ji minister Ping minister Yu is Ling." Su Li smiled embarrassedly and said, "You are right. It is a good thing that the country is prosperous and the people are at peace. I'm afraid that you won't accept it. I admire you very much since I was a child, so I take it for granted." Su Li gradually became less nervous after they talked about it. No matter what they talked about, she could quote from other sources freely. Mrs. Gu's turbid old eyes flashed with admiration. The more she looked at Su Li, the more satisfied she was. Even if she didn't want to marry Ling Li, it was also good to marry Ling Ping. Mrs. Ji was reluctant to marry such a good girl. Ling Li bowed his head all the time and didn't dare to look at Su Li. His mother and grandmother were too obvious. Su Li was not a naive girl. Grandma and mother's intention was really shameful. He could even imagine that Su Li would laugh at him in another way when they met again in the future. Child Li, the hierarch of the Enmore cult and admired by thousands of women in the martial arts circle, should be forced to marry by the elders of his family? It's really an eye-opener for me. Thinking of this, Ling Li's eyebrows twitched for a moment. Finally, he couldn't help but raise his head and interrupt, "Mom, Grandma, have a rest. You are not tired after talking so much, but Miss Su is tired." Mrs. Ji was stunned at first, and then she couldn't stop laughing. She said happily, well, you silly boy. Miss Su hasn't married yet, and you have learned to help outsiders?" Su Li was slightly stunned. What did Mrs. Ji say? The scene was quiet for a moment, and it was extremely embarrassing. Hierarch Ling, who could be calm even in front of a landslide, suddenly heard his grandmother's bold eyes. His tender face instantly turned red like a rolling fruit. Ling Qinglan almost laughed out. He had never seen Ling Li so embarrassed. Cough, cough, cough. Ling Ping suddenly coughed violently, and his loud voice immediately overshadowed Mrs. Gu's words. "Mom, it's too early for you to say that. Chiu Meng covered her face and didn't dare to look at Su Li. She reminded her mother in a low voice. Mrs. Jiyu found that she made a slip of the tongue, and her face was slightly red. How could she accidentally say what was in her mind? Fortunately, she was old and thick-skinned. Mrs. Jiyu soon recovered her composure. Chiu Meng directly skipped the previous topic and said, I heard from Ping that your teacher is Enchanting, the miracle-working doctor. Your medical skills must be very good. Can you feel the pulse for me? Su Li nodded in a hurry and smiled modestly. Of course, it's my honor to check the body of Mrs. Jiyu. Mrs. Jiyu laughed more happily. The older she was, the more she needed to be pampered. Ling Li was not sensible, and she was worried about him. Ling Ping was rude. It would be nice if he could be as sweet as Su Li. Taking a pillow and putting it on her knees, Su Li got up and walked to Mrs. Jiyu. She squatted down and gently put her white and slender hands on Mrs. Gu's wrist. At the same time, she calmed down and made a diagnosis. Whether it was out of selfishness or public interest, she hoped that Mrs. Jiyu could be healthy and live to the end of her life. Su Li ran the Ghost Valley Shengong, and the special sense immediately extended along her fingertips. No matter how noisy the outside world was, the whole carriage was quiet, waiting for Su Li to give the result. Ling Ping nodded slightly. Once, he was lucky to see Enchanting diagnose in person. His method was the same as Su Li's. Su Li really learned from Enchanting. After 5 minutes, Su Li opened her eyes, and astonishment flashed through her eyes. Mrs. Jiyu was just at the peak of the acquired realm. She was old, and she had fought many battles when she was young. There should be many sequelae of internal injuries in her body. However, she didn't find many of them. There were only some tricky internal injuries in her body. Thinking of the influence of the Enmore cult in the martial arts circle, it was not a problem to get precious elixirs. Su Li smiled slightly. Ling Li, who was observing on the side, immediately became nervous. He couldn't help but transmit the sound to Su Li. Su Li, it is not difficult for you to guess the situation of the Ling mansion with your intelligence. My identity must be hidden from my family. As long as you help me, I. When he transmitted the sound to Su Li, Ling Li stopped thinking and didn't say anything for a long time. Su Li didn't lack money or practice methods. Even the elixirs he made could be better than his. It seemed that he couldn't give Su Li any benefits, but Su Li was a person who wouldn't do anything until she saw the rabbit. If she didn't promise something, Su Li wouldn't admit it. On the basis of not violating the doctrine, you have to do one thing for me unconditionally. Su Li's voice suddenly sounded in his mind. Ling Li's face darkened. When did he fall to the point of selling favors? Before he had time to refute, Su Li had already said to everyone with a smile, Mrs. Gu's body is not serious. She just suffered from hidden injuries in her early years. Although she has been cured by doctors, the degree of cure is not accurate. The root of the disease has not been completely cured. If matriarch trusts this junior will prescribe medicine for matriarch to recuperate. Mrs. Jiyu couldn't help touching Su Li's head and said with a smile, You are very kind. How can I not believe you? Chiu Meng gently handed over the paper and pen. Her warm smile was very infectious. Su Li was in a trance for a moment. She thought of Ling Li in the previous life. No wonder he could show such a gentle smile. It should be a very happy thing to grow up with this woman. After writing the prescription, Chiu Meng carefully put it away. Su Li suddenly said, Madam, let me feel your pulse. Chiu Meng was stunned at first, and then she chuckled. She looked at Su Li with her eyes as gentle as water. She reached out her hand and said, Well, thank you, Miss Su Li madam, you are too kind. It doesn't matter. Although Chiu Meng agreed to let Su Li feel her pulse, she didn't take it seriously. Her cultivation had reached the acquired 8th hurdle, and she was still young. She should be very healthy. When Su Li felt her pulse, she frowned slightly, which made Ling Li worried. He had also secretly diagnosed his mother's body and secretly integrated it into the tea to consolidate the corporeity and nourish the primordial spirit. But she shouldn't be ill. Su Li moved away her fingertips. She hesitated and didn't speak. Ling Ping couldn't hold it anymore. He said, Miss Su Li, Just say it. What's wrong with my mother? Even Mrs. Gu didn't smile anymore. Chiu Meng didn't enjoy any happiness after marrying into the Ling mansion. She worked hard for the livelihood of the Ling mansion all day and never complained of being tired. In her heart, although Chiu Meng was not her biological daughter, she was better than her biological daughter. Su Li explained cautiously, "Madam is not sick, but an old injury. It is not difficult to cure it, but the place where she was stabbed is close to the heart vein. There is a very small and inextinguishable force that has been wearing away her flesh and blood. It seems that it has been worn away for more than 10 years. Even an iron rod can be ground into a needle. There is only a thin film left on the heart vein. If I didn't discover it in advance." Chiu Meng couldn't help but grasp the position of the heart vein. She couldn't believe it. Did Su Li mean that she was now wandering in front of the gate of hell? In the carriage, except Tang Lei who didn't understand, everyone else was shocked. Even Ling Li, who had been pretending to be cynical, was completely cold. If the heart vein was broken, she would definitely die. There was silence in the carriage. Mrs. Gu was really an old woman who had seen great storms and waves. She reacted first and said, "Miss Su, I won't say thank words. Please cure Menga first and we can talk about other things later." "Of course." Su Li nodded gently. A little green light condensed between her fingers and touched on Chiu Meng's neck. The green light immediately flowed into the heart vein along the tendons and veins of the neck. It swallowed the uneliminated force and moistened the thin barrier of the heart vein like spring rain. Chiu Meng touched the position of the heart vein. The barrier thickened too fast. She could clearly feel that the place which was slightly uncomfortable became thicker and thicker. She felt at ease. When the green light completely dissipated, the two inborn seniors in the room also saw that the broken position of Chiu Meng's heart vein was completely repaired and she recovered to health. Who? Chapter 178. Mom, I'm fine. Receiving the response of Chiu Meng's transmitted sound, old lady was relieved and couldn't help thanking Su Li. She sighed and said, "Speaking of which, Meng was injured more than 10 years ago. In order to be safe, I have to ask Miss Su Li to diagnose my grandson Ling Li. Can you also diagnose my grandson Ling Li?" Su Li was stunned for a moment. She understood Mrs. Gu's concern and had to nod. She had seen through all the problems of Ling Li and made him immune to all kinds of poisons. Now Ling Li couldn't be healthier. She returned to her seat and looked at Ling Li, but Ling Li seemed to be in a trance. It seemed that he didn't hear Mrs. Gu's words at all. Ling Li was really in a trance. His memory went back to the night 12 years ago. At that time, he was 5 years old. He came from his mother's womb. At that time, he already had the strength of the acquired 7th hurdle. That was because he was too young and his body was not fully grown. He didn't dare to practice too fast. Although he had concealed his shocking cultivation at that time, the intelligence he had displayed was quite eye-catching. Moreover, his eldest brother and second brother were all good men. His father, who had already gone to see the heavens, could not help but show off to his colleagues. Perhaps it was the excellence of the third son and the prosperity of the Ling mansion that touched some people's taboos. So, the assassin came. That day was the weakest day since the men of the Ling mansion went to war. The assassin of the inborn realm came quietly. He wanted to kill Ling Li, but Ling Li avoided the vital parts with his own body movement. Only his legs were cut by the assassin. If he was really a child without cultivation, the strength was enough to make his legs disabled. He deliberately screamed to make the assassin fail. Hearing the assassin's voice, his mother rushed over immediately. But she was stabbed in the heart by the assassin. He grabbed the sword in a hurry and used all his strength to offset a trace of strength. So, the sword didn't stab into his mother's heart meridian. Ling Li's eyes were gloomy. He still remembered the surprise and sarcasm in the assassin's eyes. For more than 10 years, he always thought that he saved his mother. Until today, he knew that the assassin left an undetectable trick. If Su Li didn't suddenly want to check Chiu Meng's body, he couldn't imagine what would have happened. Leah. Ms. Gu's voice was like the morning bell and evening drum. It woke up Ling Li, who was full of hostility. He suddenly woke up and realized where he was. But just now, he had unconsciously released the aura of a Xiantian martial artist. I've already helped you neutralize your aura. You owe me another favor now. Great Hierarch Ling Su Li's teasing transmitted sound made Ling Li breathe a sigh of relief and smile bitterly at the same time. She owed Su Li more and more things. Without the blessing of the aura, although Ling Li's expression was terrible, it was just like an angry tiger without teeth. It didn't seem to be in line with his identity as a playboy, but there were family ties in it, so it was not strange. But just at this moment, Qiu Meng's eyes were wet. Li Er was still her good friend. Li Er didn't forget what had happened in the past. She had never forgotten that her life had been saved by her third son, who was only the size of a bean sprout. Even though his legs were bleeding all over the ground at that time, even though he knew that it would be very painful to block the sword with his hands, he still roared and stood in front of her. He was only 5 years old, but he knew how to care about his mother and how to protect his important things desperately. How could such a son become a playboy? It was because of these contradictions that she and her mother felt that Li's true nature hadn't disappeared yet. He just abandoned himself because his legs were disabled. That was why the Ling mansion, which had strict family customs, allowed such a weirdo. Otherwise, according to the family rules of the Ling mansion, Ling Li would have been punished to death. Grandma, what did you say just now? I was absent-minded and didn't hear it. Looking at Ling Li, who suddenly recovered his laziness, Ms. Ji Yu, who thought that he was going to turn over a new leaf, suddenly got angry. She picked up a pillow and threw it at Ling Li. She couldn't wait to rush over and beat Ling Li. Silly boy. You are 17 years old. When will you change your playboy appearance? Do you still want to marry a good girl? Ling Li grasped the pillow firmly with one hand, but he pretended to be smashed and screamed. Qiu Meng burst into laughter and Ling Qinglan was even harder to hold back his laughter. After a while, Ms. Ji Yu took a breath and said, "Well, if I really care about you, I would have gone to see your grandfather. Young lady Su, I've let you see a joke. Please treat him." The old lady was still worried. After all, it was Qiu Meng and Ling Li who were injured at that time. Ling Li's injury was much more serious than Qiu Meng's. She was afraid that Ling Li was also injured. She had been in the army all her life. Her husband's son and even her grandson died on the battlefield. She was loyal to the country and had no regret. But if the second son of the Ling family died because of the plot of a villain, she couldn't bear it. Su Li answered softly and put one hand on the pulse of Ling Li, who had calmed down. Plop, plop. The pulse seemed to be weak, but it was the disability of the blocked meridians. But if you saw the essence through the surface, you would find that the pulse was not weak, but steady and powerful. It was like the sun burning in the sky, full of heat and vitality. Su Li slightly pursed her lips and looked a little annoyed. She looked at Ling Li's evil smile. This guy didn't guard against her. There was no genuine energy to protect his heart meridians and the brain palace. Where did he get the courage? If she wanted to kill him, she could do it now. Great Sect Master Ling is really ambitious. Su Li transmitted the sound in silence with a little annoyance. Ling Li smiled more strangely and said, "There is a voice in my heart telling me that even if all the people in the world betray me, you will not. I seem to be familiar with you. Su Li, do you know the reason?" Su Li slowly withdrew her hand and snorted into Ling Li's awareness sea. She said, "Child Ling is really the first playboy in Yunjing City. You can say these beautiful words to those little girls. Forget about me. You." Ling Li was speechless. Before he refuted, he saw Su Li suddenly smiled and said to Mrs. Ji Yu, "Mrs. Ji Yu, third childling is fine. Except for his legs, he is very healthy." "Ha. That's good. Miss Su, you really worked hard." After curing Qiu Meng's hidden danger on the spot, Mrs. Ji Yu was convinced of Su Li's medical skills. She immediately calmed down and didn't ask Su Li whether Ling Li's legs could be saved. At that time, even Qi Xianqing said that Ling Li's legs were incurable. She had already given up. But Su Li knew that even if Ling Li's legs were really disabled, although there was no way to save him in the martial arts circle, there were many elixirs in the spiritual circle that could make ordinary people reborn and regenerate broken limbs. It was not a big deal to have legs disabled. However, that kind of elixir was also precious in the spiritual circle. It was too difficult for people in the secular circle to get it. Later, Mrs. Gu wanted Su Li to help Ling Qinglan's parents, but Ling Qinglan said that he was very healthy and refused Su Li. Mrs. Gu and Qiumeng didn't doubt him, so they let him be. Ling Li felt strange. What the hell was this guy doing recently? He was so mysterious. It would be good if Su Li could feel his pulse in advance. But this guy just refused. Su Li sat back and calmed down. She had a guess about Ling Qinglan's poison in her heart. Obviously, he used a lot of cold poison, but he could still be like a normal person. Did he take that kind of elixir? Su Li glanced at Ling Li, who was sleeping beside her. The people around this guy were really not afraid of death. Ling Mo and Ling Qinglan were the same. She was about to tell Ling Qinglan the current situation to Ling Li, but the carriage suddenly stopped. Creak. The curtain of the carriage was lifted, and a servant of the Ling mansion greeted her warmly and respectfully. "Old madam, we have arrived at the hunting ground." Swoosh, a gust of wind came. Su Li looked around and saw the vast grass forest. With her eyesight, she could see the shadows of beasts flashing in the dense forest from time to time. For the autumn hunting contest, hunting in the hunting ground had been banned for a whole year. A large number of fat beasts were waiting for the young people in Yunjing City to hunt. The place where the carriage of the Ling mansion stopped was a road specially for the noble families. There were few people there. Su Li got off the carriage and glanced at the shed where the carriage was parked. There were 2 words North Town instead of Ling Ping. Although Ling Ping was a general with great military power, his name was not as important as his father, although the king of North Town was dead. Ordinary young talents went to the hunting ground in the west, while Su Li and others went to the east. There was a knot-deep river in the middle, but the royal guards guarded it. No one dared to make trouble. "Look, they are from the Ling mansion." "Ah. Oh my. I see Mrs. Gu. Really? That is the Ling family of the king of North Town." Some people in the crowd saw Mrs. Gu and there was a commotion immediately. Many people saw Mrs. Gu for the first time. They were so excited that their faces turned red. Although Mrs. Gu was old, she was still famous in Dahan country. Mrs. Gu notices the movement and turns her head. She immediately waves her hand cheerfully as a greeting, which makes the crowd clamor again. Even the people in the hunting ground could hear it. What's going on? The hunting ground is several miles away from here. How can the sound come here? Brother, it is the first time for you to come to the autumn hunting contest, right? Hey! How do you know? A flat open space in the hunting ground was surrounded by the royal guards. A high platform was built in the middle. The upper position was empty, which represented the emperor. The emperor's seat was extended to both sides. The seats were set according to the official rank of Dahan country. According to the official rank, Ling Ping was only in the 3rd grade of martial arts. But the Ling family's meritorious service couldn't really make them in the 3rd grade. Therefore, every year, the seats next to Prime Minister Tang were specially reserved to prove that the emperor was not a heartless person. This year, the seats of the Ling family were also unchanged. The seats were spacious enough to accommodate dozens of people. Compared with the crowded seats of other families, it could be seen immediately. Su Li followed the others to sit. It was quite eye-catching that others were pointing at her. They wondered when the Ling family had such an outstanding daughter. Some people recognized Su Li. They were surprised, but they didn't dare to say anything. Today, the stars were shining. The people who came here were all in high positions. Su Li was just from a poor family. Although she had the support of Qi Xianqing, she was just a nobody on this occasion. After a while, a large number of young disciples entered the hunting ground. The crowd was surging like waves. Su Li sat in the seat of the Ling family. It was rare for her to see such a spectacular scene. Su Li sat with Fatty Tang on the side because of her seniority. Fatty Tang chose a seat on the extreme left to avoid the spies of the Tang family. At the same time, he introduced the seats to Su Li. It was not easy for Tang Lei to be familiar with these small families. Su Li didn't know whether it was a coincidence or not. The seat opposite the Ling family was also the general's mansion, the Wu family. Wu Xiuxiu was the apple of the Ling family. She sat in the middle with Wu Jin. She was young and had an exquisite figure. Her face was delicate and picturesque, but her rather ferocious expression destroyed the beauty. Because she saw Su Li sitting in the seat of the Ling family at a glance. Chapter 179. Feeling the naked and undisguised gaze, Su Li followed the line of sight and saw Wu Xiuxiu. She pretended to be stunned and then nodded with a smile. Her heart was cold. She didn't have time to deal with the Wu family, but the brother and sister hurried to make trouble for her. Did they really think that they didn't have a long life? Seeing the kind smile on Su Li's face, Wu Xiuxiu was stunned. Xie Hua immediately came out. A sense of humiliation came to her heart. This bitch. Did she think that she could be on an equal footing with Su Li because she had a relationship with the Ling family? How dare she greet her in such a humble manner? If it weren't for the wrong occasion, she would rush over and slap the bitch who didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. Wu Xiuxiu's chest rose and fell violently. She suppressed her anger. Wu Jin soon found that. He followed Wu Xiuxiu's eyes and saw Su Li. His eyes were a little deeper, but he smiled lightly and said a few words in Wu Xiuxiu's ear. Wu Xiuxiu immediately turned from anger to joy. She held Wu Jin's arm and acted like a spoiled child. She also showed off to Su Li. Su Li raised her eyebrows slightly. It was not suitable to explore with psychic awareness on this occasion. Wu Jin didn't let her see his lips. She didn't know what the brother and sister whispered to each other. However, even if Wu Jin wanted to continue to fight with her, he had to consider the current situation in Yunjing City. What happened in the Su family had attracted the attention of all princes. If Wu Jin dared to fight with her rashly, she didn't need to fight with him personally. The eldest son of the general would be killed. The first prince is here. The sharp voice of the eunuch with cultivation spread through the audience and fell clearly into everyone's ears. Su Li looked up and saw that there was one more person on the high platform. It was Dongfang Sheng in a golden robe. He was high-spirited and reckless. He didn't lower his voice when he met Chu Lu at all. The one who shouted was Eunuch Feng, whom she met in the waterside pavilion in the south of the city that day. Su Li didn't know whether the emperor came in person today. After Dongfang Sheng sat down, Eunuch Feng shouted again, "The third prince is here." The scene of the royal family couldn't be small. Princes and princesses must learn to be familiar with the high platform from an early age. The third prince, Dongfang Lang, who was also wearing a golden robe with a different pattern, floated over. His footsteps were light and quick, as if there was wind under his feet. His expression was calm, as if he was stepping on the void as he ascended the high platform. He was a refined scholar with high cultivation, causing the young talents below the platform to exclaim in admiration. Dongfang Sheng was gloomy for a moment, and then he became happy in an instant. He got up and smiled. Then, the fifth prince Dongfang Yang appeared. Compared with Dongfang Lang, he was ordinary, but he was the most handsome among the princes. He was known as the most handsome man in Yunjing City. As soon as Dongfang Yangfang appeared, his clothes fluttered in the wind. His handsome face, which was as gentle as jade, immediately caused many women to scream. The first prince's face was even more unsightly. Even fifth brother's extravagance was inferior to him. If father heard this, how could he take over the Eastern Palace? Su Li looked at the princes on the high platform with interest. She sighed in her heart. Sure enough, they were born in the royal family. Their acting skills were not bad. Dongfang Sheng and Dongfang Lang fought fiercely in secret. When they appeared in front of outsiders, they immediately became brothers. It was really interesting. At this moment, Eunuch Feng shouted again, "The seventh prince is here." Su Li was a little surprised. She looked at the last prince who appeared. She was a little dignified. The seventh prince, Dongfang Wuxue. Dongfang Wuxue was only 12 years old this year. With a thought, a child no taller than 4 feet slowly climbed onto the platform. His appearance could not be said to be cute, nor could it be said to be handsome. It was just a plain, ordinary face. His mother was not favored in the palace and could be said to be the weakest prince in the palace. "The seventh brother is here," The high platform is very steep. Don't fall. The three of them smiled and said considerate words, but no one went to help Dongfang Wuxue. Dongfang Wuxue was too young. The emperor was old and was about to abdicate. None of them regarded the seventh brother as a competitor. Only Su Li knew that in the previous life, the seventh prince, who looked ordinary, suddenly became the next emperor of the Dahan country. No one knew the specific reason. After all the princes arrived, Eunuch Feng went to the high platform and announced the reward of the autumn hunting for the emperor. It was normal for the emperor to stay in the palace for many years. The families didn't feel strange. They secretly discussed which prince could live in the East Palace. Recently, the emperor was old and weak. He was not as energetic as before. It seemed that he wanted to choose a crown prince. Ling Li was half lying in the wheelchair. He was dozing off. His mouth was still drooling. The disciples in the surrounding seats couldn't help but show their disgust and turned their heads. Ling Li was really the shame of the young people in Yunjing City. Looking at Ling Li's acting, Su Li laughed in her heart. Her attention was still on the princes. The princes must come to watch the autumn hunting every year. If they reached the age of 18, they must participate in the autumn hunting experience. They couldn't be lazy. The first prince, the third prince and the fifth prince were all over 18 years old. After a while, only Dongfang Wuxue was watching the show on the high platform. God feels that it is not easy for people to live in the world. This year, the weather is good, the country is prosperous and the people are at peace. The autumn hunting contest will be held as scheduled. If a young talent has extraordinary performance and wins the first prize, he can enter the palace to meet the emperor and listen to the god's grace. He will also receive the superior mental cultivation method of Xiangong, the magic weapon Hongyuan sword and a precious branch. Then, Eunuch Feng took out the book and the sword and put them on the high platform. It immediately attracted a lot of people's attention to the thin book. The secret method of Xiangong. It was the key to the poor disciples. Only by getting the Xiangong could they break through the limit of the common people and become real warriors. If they could reach the inborn realm, they could change their fate and be valued by the imperial court. They could even open up their own families. Which poor disciple would be able to endure such temptation? In the end, Eunuch Feng put the trunk of a withered tree on the table and explained happily, "This thing is offered by a small country. It is not only invulnerable to swords and spears, but also difficult to be melted by real fire. His Majesty specially chose this thing and gave it to the destined person." After he said that, the audience didn't respond. It was difficult to attract attention if they couldn't see the actual benefits. But there were 3 people on the seats of the Ling mansion who fixed their eyes on the branch. The bark was like a feather and the grain was like a bird. It was not an unknown withered tree. It was clearly the branch of the Kurong tree. Since Su Li made an agreement with him, he checked a lot of precious ancient books to get the appearance of the Kurong tree. The Tianya house tried its best to search, but they couldn't get any information about the branch of the Kurong tree. He didn't expect that the Kurong tree suddenly appeared in front of him today. It was really a case of wearing out iron shoes in fruitless searching, but finding it by chance. The second brother's cultivation was the highest among all the people, and his age didn't exceed the limit of the contest. With the help of Ling Qinglan, it was easy to get the branch of the Kurong tree. Qinglan. He transmitted the sound in silence to Ling Qinglan. Ling Qinglan's heart sank slightly. He vaguely grasped his chest, but he still nodded and transmitted the sound in silence. "I know. This time, I will try my best to help second brother win the title of the champion." Hearing Ling Qinglan's response, Ling Li grinned and pulled Ling Ping's sleeve. Ling Ping turned his head in confusion. When he saw Ling Li, who didn't look like a playboy but looked serious, he couldn't help but be shocked. He said, "Second brother, I don't ask you for anything. But I must get the branch of the withered tree." Ling Ping, who just wanted to relax, immediately changed his mind. He was full of fighting spirit and solemnly whispered, "Second brother, I will win it for you." Indeed, the third brother never asked him for anything. Even if the third brother didn't know the origin of the withered tree, he must fight for it. What's more, it seemed that the third brother recognized what the withered tree was. Ling Ping glanced at those who didn't take the name of the dried branch seriously. He couldn't help but smile. They all said that the third brother was ignorant and incompetent. But today, none of the so-called talented scholars recognized the dried branch. Only the third brother recognized it. How could they continue to say that the third brother was a waste? He often heard Ling Li's playboy theory. Although he didn't say it, it didn't mean that he was not angry. Today was a good time to vent his anger. Mother, Qinglan and I will go first, Ling Ping said and turned to prepare. Since it was the autumn hunting contest, good horses and bows were indispensable. Su Li stood up and smiled. Thank you for your care all the way. I also want to have a look. If I come to the autumn hunting contest but don't participate, it will be a pity. Su Li's reason couldn't be refuted. Mrs. Gu didn't stop her. Instead, she laughed and said, Go ahead. Since you regard me as your goal, you should be aware of it. In addition, she saw that Su Li had the cultivation of the acquired 8th hurdle. As long as she didn't encounter dozens of beasts at the same time, she would not be in danger. Under the control of the Northwest Hunting Ground, it was impossible for beasts to gather together. So, there was no danger at all. However, because women were born weak, only a few female warriors dared to participate in the contest. Ling Li stared at Su Li leaving and didn't speak. This girl was proficient in refining the secret medicine. Her cultivation might not be far from his. All the beasts in the hunting ground couldn't be her opponent. What did she want to do? Did she want to get the branch of the Kurong tree in person and then let him increase the bargaining chip? Don't watch her. She has gone far away. If you really like Miss Su, don't fool around all day. Spend more time on her. Chiu Meng patted Ling Li's shoulder gently and scolded him. Ling Li came back to himself and smiled. He couldn't say that he had a close relationship with Su Li and even slept on her bed. When the sundial turned the hour, Eunuch Feng's sharp voice broke through the void. The huge and heavy iron gate of the hunting ground finally opened slowly. The autumn hunting contest starts now. For a time, thousands of horses galloped and the noise shook the sky. Su Li's horse was not good. She fell into the last group of people. Her horse was randomly chosen from the horse farm outside the hunting ground. Because she didn't plan to participate in the autumn hunting at the beginning. Just as Ling Li thought, the level of the Northwest hunting ground was too low for her. She was not interested in it at all. However, Wu Jin had a lot of bad ideas. Ling Qinglan might not be able to take action. It was hard to guarantee that Ling Ping wouldn't be secretly set up. Wu Xiuxiu's smile also made her care. If she couldn't get the branch of the Kurong tree, she would be very troubled. It was easier to take action in the dark. After thinking about it, she thought it was better to take action by herself. As the horses ran, everyone's sight was out of the observation of the people on the high platform. Chapter 180. Roar. The tiger's roar came from all directions, and the horse neighed uneasily. The young man standing in the middle of the open space was pale and sweaty. He pulled the hemp rope and kept observing. He grasped the arrow in his hand tightly and his pupils shrank in fear. Didn't they say that there were not many beasts in the hunting ground? Why did I meet one as soon as I came up? Roar. Roar. The whistling sound was getting closer and closer, almost reaching his ears. The young man had already lost his composure. He got off the horse and leaned on its back, staring at the other side. However, he did not notice that a majestic tiger was quietly approaching him, its eyes filled with cruelty and fierceness. Nay. The horse had a keen intuition. It was frightened and immediately ran wildly. The moment the young man suddenly turned back, he suddenly saw the tiger rushing at him. The tiger's head was enlarged in his eyes, and even the sun in the sky was completely covered by it. It's over. The young man was so scared that he collapsed on the ground and completely lost the ability to resist. He closed his eyes and waited for death. Suddenly, puff! The sound of the long sword piercing the flesh was heard, and then a plop came into the young man's ears. It seemed that a heavy object fell on the ground. Then he smelled a strong smell of blood. I am not dead. The young man opened his eyes and saw his intact hands. Then he looked up and saw a tiger without a pair of ears. He didn't see anyone selling it from beginning to end. After a while, he finally ran to the high platform crazily. Ghost. Mom, I want to go home. The hunting ground is so terrible. Sue Lee, who was hiding in the forest, shook her head slightly. He dared to come here without hunting experience. No wonder many people died in the autumn hunting every year. Counting this pair of tiger ears, it should be the 37th tiger. Continue. After counting the harvest in the bag, Sue Lee flashed away. She didn't know where the horse was. The speed was not as fast as using the martial arts movement. At this moment, the same scene was happening on the other side of the hunting ground. Qinglan, count how many there are. Ling Ping wiped his sweat and took a breath. For Ling Li, he kept looking for beasts to kill. But the hunting ground was too big, and he was only in the inborn first hurdle. He couldn't completely abandon the horse and only rely on the martial arts movement. Besides, even if he couldn't leave Ling Qinglan alone. After all, Ling Qinglan hadn't reached the inborn realm. 25 in total. Hearing Ling Qinglan's words, Ling Ping's eyes brightened. He said, "Good luck. But Wu Jin is out of the game. We can't take it lightly. Let's go deeper." It's not easy to hear Ling Li ask for help. I can't let him down. Ling Qinglan smiled bitterly and drove the horse to follow them. The scope of his psychic awareness was much larger than that of Ling Ping. Although he couldn't fight with others now, he could deliberately guide Ling Ping to a certain direction. Therefore, the so-called luck became inevitable. If there was no accident, Ling Ping would win the first place. 3 days were enough for them to hunt nearly half of the beasts in the hunting ground. In the blink of an eye, it was already the 3rd day. Ling Qinglan's eyes were dark. He sat on the horse and looked tired. Ling Ping couldn't help but scold him with a smile. "I told you to practice hard and not to get involved in cases. But you didn't listen. Now, you can't even last for 3 days and 3 nights. I'll definitely get your aunt to teach you a lesson later." Ling Qinglan could only bow his head and accept Ling Ping's reprimand. He didn't expect that he could barely maintain the basic life. The speed of the efficacy of the medicine was much faster than he imagined. Is it because of the frequent use of the psychic awareness these days? Ling Qinglan secretly gritted his teeth. This body was really useless. While he was annoyed, Ling Qinglan didn't find that the surrounding illusion was slowly changing. The noises in the surrounding jungle suddenly disappeared and it became dead silent. Ling Ping noticed it, but it was too late. Well, where is this place? The light in the jungle quickly dimmed. It was dark in the blink of an eye. Ling Ping's expression changed slightly. His muscles tightened and he immediately protected the heavy prey hanging on the horse. Who is sneaking around? This is the Northwest hunting ground, the royal land. If you dare to kill me here, you should think about the consequences. The first thought in Ling Ping's mind was that it was his sworn enemy, Wu Jin. But according to Wu Jin's cautious character, he would never kill him on this occasion if he was not absolutely sure. Otherwise, if his grandmother was angry, it would be enough to shake the situation of the Dahan country. Even the death of his father and grandfather would be blamed on the Wu family by his grandmother. At that time, even if the emperor didn't want to kill the Wu family, he had to. Wu Jin wouldn't do the strategy of mutual destruction. Ling Qinglan forced himself to get down from the horse. He staggered and looked even more terrible. His psychic awareness detected that there were as many as 5 seniors of the inborn realm. Even if he could kill them, he was absolutely no match for them. What's more, they trapped them with the tactical matrix in advance. This was a surefire way to kill him. The royal family had been established for hundreds of years and had a profound foundation. The entire Northwest hunting ground was protected by a big tactical matrix. Even a senior at the peak of the inborn realm couldn't break in, unless they all sneaked in through formal channels. But the students of the National Academy relied on the jade token that was connected with their own bloodline. Other big families also had a quota limit. If a stranger sneaked in, he would be found out at a glance. What kind of person could secretly arrange for someone to sneak into the hunting ground and assassinate them? Ling Qinglan slowly walked to Ling Ping and stood back to back. A fan appeared in his hand. He deduced and looked for the flaws of the tactical matrix. But he soon found that the level of the tactical matrix was too high, far beyond the scope that he could solve. Qinglan. Ling Ping suddenly whispered, I will aim at the northwest and forcibly open a hole. You must escape. The Ling family needs someone to support it. This group of people was likely to come for him. Then, Qinglan would have a chance to escape. If there was no man in the Ling family who was an official in the imperial court, the Ling family would be like a fish on the chopping block. His grandma, mother, and brother would not have a good end. He absolutely could not allow that situation to happen. Ling Qinglan smiled bitterly. Ignorance was fearless. If he knew that he had detected 8 breaths above the inborn 4th hurdle, he would not say such optimistic words. However, even if he had to die today, he would bite off a piece of the enemy's flesh. Ling Qinglan's eyes were fierce, and the breath of the inborn 3rd hurdle began to brew. Swish, 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 swish. 8 black shadows appeared at the same time. They knew that they were walking on the edge of a knife. If they delayed, there would be changes. They didn't say any nonsense and instantly attacked. Every move was aimed at the fatal point. The majestic breath of the inborn realm submerged Ling Ping like a wave. Ling Ping's face instantly became pale. At this moment, he finally understood what was called a desperate situation. Ling Ping held the saber horizontally to block his vital point. He gritted his teeth and wanted to bear the 8 attacks. He knew that he might not be able to bear them. But if he stepped aside, Ling Qinglan behind him would definitely die. Second brother, get out of the way. Ling Ping was shocked for a moment when he heard Ling Qinglan's words. But he still believed in his brother. He rolled on the ground and barely dodged all kinds of weapons. Knives, spears, sticks came to Ling Qinglan's face in the blink of an eye. The next moment, Ling Qinglan would be split into 2 halves. Qinglan. Ling Ping was furious, but Ling Qinglan's expression was cold. In the face of danger, he didn't hesitate. The folding fan in his hand was broken into half, and countless poisonous needles flew out from it. They covered the 8 people like flying flowers. The poisonous needles were made of 1,000-year-old cold iron. It was easy for them to pierce the inborn shield. Want to kill me? Unless you are willing to die with me. Shockingly, it was a method of mutual destruction. The situation changed suddenly. The faces of the 8 killers in the inborn realm changed slightly. Of course, they didn't want to die with him. What's more, their target was not Ling Qinglan but Ling Ping. Almost in an instant, all the killers chose to defend. For a time, the poisonous needles and weapons collided with each other. Clang sounds were constantly heard. Ling Qinglan was relieved. He flashed to Ling Ping's side. He threw the remaining half of the fan at the feet of the 2 killers and ran the secret method forcefully. His fan was made of materials collected by the Enmore cult for 5 years and the famous refining master in the martial arts circle. It could fight with magic weapons at ordinary times. At the critical moment, it could be a peerless treasure for both attack and defense. It was because he carried this fan with him that he had the confidence to reverse the situation when facing the 8 killers in the inborn realm. In Ling Ping's shocked eyes, the remaining half of the fan expanded with the wind. In the blink of an eye, it was big enough for 2 people to stand. The yin and yang fish rotated on it. A transparent barrier extended out and instantly turned into a protective tactical matrix. It was too late for the 8 killers to react. Damn it! How could there be such a change? The leading killer looked ferocious. He looked at the protective tactical matrix with light constantly flowing on the surface. The quality was absolutely not a low-level tactical matrix that could be broken by a senior in the inborn realm. Ling Qinglan had such a treasure. Qinglan, why do you? Ling Ping's eyes were full of doubts. He found that he couldn't see through his cousin. Whether it was the poisonous needles or the tactical matrix, they were far beyond the scope of his understanding. Ling Qinglan heard Ling Ping's words and smiled reluctantly. When he was about to deal with it, he spat out a mouthful of blood and fell down. Ling Ping's expression changed greatly. He quickly grabbed Ling Qinglan and said, Qinglan, Qinglan, how are you? As soon as his hands touched Ling Qinglan's hands, his pupils shrank and he was full of horror. How could Ling Qinglan's body be so cold? He was like a dead person. He looked down at the blood on his chest. There was a layer of frost on it. It took a long time for it to fade away. This was not the injury just now. Even if Ling Ping was stupid, he understood at this moment that Ling Qinglan had a disease in his body. He remembered that a few years ago, his cousin was extremely weak. No matter how many clothes he wore, he always shrank his body. Later, he was inexplicably cured. Ling Ping thought that he was cured by the doctor, so he didn't care about it. Now thinking of it, Ling Ping knew that the disease had not been cured at all. In the carriage, he refused Su Li's diagnosis. Maybe he already knew this. But in the past 2 days, he took Ling Qinglan to run around and even laughed at him for delaying his practice. He didn't notice the abnormality at all. Damn it. Qinglan, you must hold on. I will ask Su Li to cure you immediately. She is the apprentice of the miracle-working doctor. She must have a way. At this moment, the killers outside the tactical matrix had begun to bombard it. Ling Ping didn't have time to pay attention to them. He called Ling Qinglan again and again. He was afraid that Ling Qinglan would die in his arms like his eldest brother. Ling Ping's words came from the sky. It was far away and inaudible. Ling Qinglan's pupils were dilated and fixed in the void. He seemed to see the happy time in the Yi family many years ago. Dad, Mom, I am too tired. I want to find you, but I haven't avenged you. I'm not reconciled. With a groan, Ling Qinglan began to focus his eyes. He looked up and saw Ling Ping, who was crying. The young general, who had never shed tears, was full of panic and hesitation at this moment. Chapter 181. Ling Qinglan's weak voice came. Ling Ping was shocked and immediately overjoyed. He held Ling Qinglan's hands tightly and said, "Qinglan, I'm here. Don't cry." Then, he wiped his nose hard and showed a smile that was uglier than crying. Ling Qinglan slowly took out a jade bottle from his chest. Without saying anything, Ling Ping immediately took a handful of elixirs and put them into Ling Qinglan's mouth. Two is enough. It's useless to eat more. Ling Qinglan swallowed 2 elixirs. The efficacy of the elixirs spread in his body. His cold body quickly returned to normal temperature. He gasped and sat up. Looking at the killers who bombarded the protective tactical matrix tirelessly, he couldn't help but sneer, "You are really persistent. I want to see how long you can persist. This is the Northwest hunting ground. The longer you stay here, the faster you will die." The leading killer stopped for a moment, and then bombarded more fiercely. Ling Qinglan sighed in his heart. He didn't expect that it was counterproductive. These killers in the inborn realm were like the men of sacrifice trained by the Sholu cult. They didn't care about their own lives at all. Second brother, although the tactical matrix is good, it will be broken in a quarter of an hour without follow-up energy supply. At that moment, I will control the explosion of the tactical matrix. Maybe I can blow up the trap tactical matrix. That moment is the best time to escape. Ling Ping was shocked by Ling Qinglan's transmitted sound. It turned out that Brother Lan's cultivation had already reached the acquired 8th hurdle. "Qinglan, your injury. There is no medicine to cure the cold poison. Even if you invite Qi Yanqing, the result will be the same. At this moment, I can use the last bit of time to create a way for you to survive. My life is not in vain." Ling Qinglan smiled freely and didn't hide anything. The autumn hunting contest would end in half a day. No one in the hunting ground could compete with these 8 people. They would definitely die this time. There was no need for him to hide anything. Ling Ping's face immediately turned pale. His lips trembled and he wanted to say something. But finally, he found that he had no words and couldn't say anything. "Second brother, don't be sad. I am weak. It's the best gift from God that I can live for 14 years. But I still haven't found out the reason why my family was destroyed." Ling Qinglan said with pity. Ling Ping felt complicated and said in a low voice, after going back, "I will ask Chen Gong to continue to investigate the case of the Yi family for you." In the face of despair, He had already recognized the current situation. He no longer naively believed that the two of them could escape. In fact, whether he could escape or not was still a variable. The light on the transparent shield dimmed, and a crack finally appeared. When the assassins saw the crack, it was as if they had been injected with chicken blood. They used all their strength to attack the crack, causing it to expand continuously. Ling Qinglan saw that the yin-yang fish under his feet began to crack from the middle, and he couldn't help but shake his head. If he controlled the tactical matrix, even the inborn ninth hurdle would need to bombard it for more than an hour. Unfortunately, his body was like a porcelain that was full of cracks and could not withstand the recoil of the array. He could only use his last bit of strength to detonate the array. As the cracks gradually expanded in his eyes like a spider web, Ling Ping's body gradually tightened. Whether he could survive or not depended on God. Second brother. Ling Qinglan moved slightly. He was in the yin and yang sides. In Ling Ping's confused eyes, he suddenly said, "Go back and say sorry to Ling Li for me." Boom. Ling Ping had no time to ask, and the tactical matrix had been blasted. Ling Qinglan shouted and pressed his hands on the yin and yang sides. Explode. Boom. A more violent explosion appeared in front of Ling Qinglan and attacked the 8 assassins. Ling Ping was full of grief and indignation. He instantly rushed out from behind Ling Qinglan and roared, "Brother Lan, I will pass your words to Brother Li." The huge smoke and dust slowly dispersed. Ling Ping leaned against the edge of the darkness with a blank face. He supported Ling Qinglan, who was coughing blood. He was at a loss. The trap tactical matrix did not disappear. He even tried his best to cut the edge of the tactical matrix, but the result was a broken knife. The heavens were not on their side. Ling Qinglan's pale face showed a bitter smile. "Second brother, it seems that we are destined to die this time. I have no strength to fight anymore." Ling Ping saw the 8 assassins of the inborn realm rushing to him with monstrous killing intent behind the smoke and dust. He threw the broken long knife on the ground and showed a deep helplessness. "You have done a good job. Second brother is useless." But at this moment, a little cold light appeared in the darkness. In Ling Qinglan's astonished gaze, it suddenly expanded. Clatter. The bright sunlight penetrated in, followed by an afterimage. Puff, puff, puff. 3 heads flew into the sky, and a rain of blood filled the sky. The remaining 5 people retreated in horror. They finally saw the person clearly. It was a young man in cyan with red lips and white teeth. "You want to kill the Ling family? Have you asked me?" Su Li's face was full of killing intent. Her tone was cold, and her eyes almost froze the remaining 5 people of the inborn realm. They had never seen such a terrible teenager. Inborn master. His cultivation was far beyond theirs. They were no match for him. The assassination plan failed. These thoughts emerged in the minds of the 5 people at the same time. Then, without any hesitation, they fled in 5 directions. Su Li's face was colder. She opened her hands, and the weapons and countless poisonous needles on the ground floated up one after another. They were divided into 5 directions as if they had spirits. They penetrated the void in a blink of an eye and reached the assassins' backs. Plop. 5 corpses fell to the ground almost at the same time. They wanted to escape in front of the AO sword skills? No way. In just a few seconds, the 8 people of the inborn realm died. Ling Qinglan and Ling Ping were shocked. They stood still and didn't know what to do. The 8 people of the inborn realm who forced them into a desperate situation didn't even have time to breathe in the hands of the teenager. It was terrible. There was such a young master in Yunjing City. Ling Ping couldn't help but swallow. When he came to his senses, he found that he and Ling Qinglan survived miraculously. Tick. A drop of sweat dripped down Su Li's cheek. On the last day, she was looking for Ling Ping's trace. She found the fluctuation of the tactical matrix nearby. Then, she almost rushed here without stopping and finally caught up with him. However, it seemed that the tactical matrix had been routed for almost 10 minutes. Thanks to Ling Ping and Ling Qinglan, they could resist the 8 people for such a long time. Su Li breathed a sigh of relief and turned around with a warm smile on her face. She said, "Lord Ling, I haven't seen you for a long time. How are you?" The greeting was the same as that night. Ling Qinglan stared at the teenager in cyan in a daze. He was shocked and said, "Li. Mr. Li? Who is Mr. Li?" Ling Ping was at a loss. He couldn't understand Ling Qinglan. How could he know such a young master with unfathomable cultivation? "I have met him once in the Supreme Judiciary," Ling Qinglan explained in a hurry. He stepped forward and bowed deeply, this time. "Mr. Li, thank you for saving our lives." This gratitude was sincere. This time, they were really pulled back from the gates of hell by Su Li. If Su Li came one step later, the consequences would be unimaginable. Su Li waved her hand and calmed down. Then she took back the 5 corpses that escaped and put them on the ground. She put them in a row with the other 3 people. After lifting the black cloth on their faces, Ling Ping and Ling Qinglan couldn't help but look closer. But they were all strange faces. Sure enough, they are all secretly trained men of sacrifice. Ling Qinglan frowned and said to himself. Then he smiled and said, "But this time, Mr. Li killed 8 people in the inborn realm. The hidden force must be greatly weakened." Su Li didn't say anything. She tied up the 8 corpses and put them aside. Then she took out a thin piece of paper from her arms and wrote a line of words with blood. Then she handed it to Ling Qinglan along with a cyan elixir. "You are really not afraid of death. You even dare to eat the Ligua elixir. Have you even written a will?" Hearing Su Li's teasing words, Ling Qinglan's face changed slightly. Sure enough, she saw through him. "I went back and thought about it. I found that you are wrong. You abused the cold poison and were still vigorous. Do you really think that the cold poison is a sick cat?" Su Li scolded in a tone of an elder, "If I didn't find it early, you should die here today. That guy in your study should be dead in 2 days." Ling Qinglan smiled bitterly and let Su Li scold him. Because Mr. Li was right. "I came out in a hurry. I don't have any elixir. You eat it first to stabilize your injury. Tomorrow, come here alone to find me," Su Li said. She didn't look at Ling Ping. She took the corpse and disappeared. Ling Qinglan looked at the bloody words in his hand. It was a very remote alley. Did Mr. Li live there? Ling Ping enjoyed being ignored, but he was very happy. He quickly let Ling Qinglan swallow the elixir. Although he didn't know what the Ligua elixir was, it was definitely not a good thing according to Mr. Li's tone. "By the way, it is troublesome to hold it. I will give it to you." Su Li came back and threw a sack at Ling Ping's feet. Ling Ping opened it and was even more shocked. There were hundreds of pairs of beast ears in it. In addition, the prey they hunted in the past 2 days accounted for 70% of the beasts in the hunting ground. The first place of the autumn hunting contest was already in the bag. Ling Ping was really surprised that such an unfathomable person would deal with the beasts that were not even in the inborn hurdle. However, Ling Qinglan thought deeply. Did Mr. Li always pay attention to the Ling family in recent days? Otherwise, he couldn't appear in such a timely manner. Phew, Ling Qinglan relaxed and breathed a sigh of relief. He carried the sack on his back and said with a smile, "Second brother, I don't know what Mr. Li's purpose is. But no matter what, we've survived today's crisis. Let's go." Ling Ping was stunned for a moment. Then he smiled again. He grabbed the sack from Ling Qinglan and carried it on his back. He said with a smile, "I know that no matter how much you hide, you still care about the Ling family. I won't ask you anymore. After today, you must find Mr. Li. Maybe he has a different vision and can really cure the cold poison." Ling Qinglan nodded and felt warm in his heart. His smile was more sincere than before. He never regarded himself as a member of the Ling family, but the Ling family treated him as their own. He shouldn't have such a mentality. Chapter 182. After Su Li returned the clothes to the young man who fainted in the grass, she followed the trajectory of the tactical matrix and found a flaw that she had agreed with Fang Yuan and others before. However, it was difficult to make a perfect tactical matrix. The northwest hunting ground covered an area of hundreds of thousands of hectares. It was too large and had been in disrepair for a long time. Naturally, there would be many weaknesses in the tactical matrix. People who didn't know the tactical matrix had no way to deal with these weaknesses. But if someone was proficient in the tactical matrix, he could use the flaws to forcibly create an entrance and exit that could be passed in a short time. Unfortunately, Su Li had studied the tactical matrix for a period of time in her previous life and was guided by a famous teacher. Although she was not superb in the tactical matrix, she could be regarded as a real tactical matrix master. She didn't need to create any entrance and exit at all. She could directly walk out of the big tactical matrix with her own strength. In the wasteland outside the city, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning were practicing and waiting patiently. Yin Xuetong was busy with the business of the Linli building. Recently, the business of the Linli building was a little better. They also recruited 1 or 2 temporary waiters to help. When the first batch of people trained in the secluded site came out, there would be enough people. Damn the weather. It's a sunny day. Why does it start to rain? Chu Qingning licked his lips and opened the water bag. Fang Yuan slowly opened his eyes and looked at the tactical matrix barrier that could not be seen but could be touched. Although he was not worried about Su Li's safety, it was difficult to ensure that Su Li needed help in the hunting ground. Therefore, they agreed to meet Su Li outside the tactical matrix. Fang Yuan also knew for the first time that the big tactical matrix of the northwest hunting ground was not really inaccessible. It turned out that Su Li's attainments in the tactical matrix were so high. At this time, the nothingness in front of everyone rippled, and then they saw Su Li dragging 8 corpses out. 3 of them had their heads buckled on the waist. It was really horrible. Puff, Chu Qingning was drinking water from the water bag. Seeing Su Li in this shape, he immediately sprayed water everywhere. Su Li, what are you? Fang Yuan stood up and looked dignified. Su Li threw the corpses in front of everyone and said quickly, "Take them back. They are useful to me. Wait for me to go back." After saying this, Su Li turned around and disappeared into the tactical matrix in the blink of an eye. Fang Yuan came to check. The corpses were still warm. They had just died, and the inborn pneuma had not completely dissipated. These people were all in the inborn realm. Oh, 8 innates. When did innates become so worthless? Chu Qingning sighed, and his eyes changed. He really felt that his cultivation could not keep up with Su Li's, and he had to practice harder. Su Li returned to the hunting ground and pretended to hunt a few small preys. Then she leisurely followed the tracks of Ling Ping and Fang Yuan and returned to the high platform. It took a lot of time to find the flaws of the tactical matrix. At this moment, it was close to the end of the meeting. So, Su Li had no time to talk with Fang Yuan and hurried back to the hunting ground. Eunuch Feng led a group of trusted eunuchs to count the casualties and the beast ears. Obviously, these eunuchs were not ordinary. All of them had achieved great cultivation and had experienced many hardships. No matter if someone came back with a broken arm or a broken leg or a dead body, they would not be moved. Under the strange gaze of the eunuch, Su Li threw out a pair of rabbit ears and deer. She only killed them along the way, and the harvest was pitiful. That's all. Did she go on an autumn outing for the past 3 days? People around couldn't help but whisper. Looking at their harvest, they all had a sense of superiority. Even if they were mediocre, they were much better than this girl. Hey, isn't this Su Li? Finally, someone recognized Su Li. The surprised voice attracted the attention of a large group of people. The counting seats immediately became crowded. Where? Let me see. Don't push. A group of animals competed with each other. Finally, they didn't see Su Li leave from a special passage. The first person heard the previous discussion and couldn't help but sneer. Miss Su Li is kind-hearted. Naturally, she will not do those things. What's wrong with an autumn outing? She is the disciple of the miracle-working Dr. Qi Xianqing. She doesn't lack martial arts and weapons. The rewards of the meeting are useless to her. She is so young, and her cultivation has reached the acquired 8th hurdle. She is much higher than any of us. If we really fight, which one of us is her opponent? A group of ignorant people even have the face to laugh at Miss Su Li. Yes, you are really ashamed for us men. A group of Su Li's fans stood up and instantly made the young man who had laughed at Su Li speechless and ashamed. The fight didn't reach Su Li's ears. Even if Su Li heard it, she would only laugh it off. She had long gotten rid of the childish and meaningless quarrel. Miss Su is back. Fatty Tang stood up happily to greet her. Seeing Su Li's clothes were neat without any blood, he immediately breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Miss Su, it's great that you are fine." After getting along with Su Li for many days in the affiliated school, Tang Lei's fear of Su Li subsided a little. Their relationship also improved. He called her Miss Su instead of Lecturer Su. Su Li smiled and nodded, "I am going to see the scenery. Naturally, there is no danger." After saluting to Ms. Jiyu and Qiu Meng, Su Li sat back to her original position. She saw Ling Ping and Ling Qinglan in the surging crowd and the confused young man in cyan whose clothes were taken by her. Su Li sighed secretly. He happened to be nearby, and he happened to wear cyan clothes. She also kept some beast ears for him, which could be regarded as a way to calm him down. The master of the Wu family is here. General Ling Ping is also back. When the two main characters appeared, the crowd suddenly became quiet. Even those who were still queuing to count the beast ears consciously gave way. There was a big empty circle in front of the counting table. Wu Jin stood on one side, and Ling Ping and Ling Qinglan stood on the other side. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. Ms. Jiyu frowned and looked at the audience. She didn't worry that Ping couldn't win the first prize, but there were many villains in the Wu family. This time, it was very likely that they would play tricks. If Ping didn't have a way to deal with it, he might lose. Haha, what a coincidence. Did second brother Ling just come back? Wu Jin smiled. It seemed that he had forgotten what happened in the waterside pavilion in the south of the city. Coincidence? Did the master of the Wu family read too many books? Is there something wrong with your brain? The time of the autumn hunting has come. If I don't come back, should I still watch outside? Ling Ping said sarcastically. He didn't care about Wu Jin at all, which made the crowd burst into laughter. Wu Jin didn't change his expression when he heard that. He waved his hand and said, "Of course not. Second brother Ling is really hot-tempered." At this time, Ling Qinglan sat on the ground without caring about his image. He was interested in Wu Jin's performance. With the help of Mr. Li, he was not worried about the result of the autumn hunting. However, Ling Li saw Ling Qinglan sit down suddenly. He frowned instantly. He seemed to be very tired. Did the cold poison take effect? Or, what happened in the past 2 days? No matter Wu Jin, Ling Ping or Ling Qinglan, they were inevitably stained with blood. It was difficult to distinguish whether it was human blood or beast blood. Although the Enmore cult had a strong infiltration ability, it was not powerful enough to infiltrate the royal guards of the emperor. He didn't know what happened on the hunting ground. Ling Qinglan's expression of sitting down to watch the monkey show made Wu Jin's smile slightly stiff. He and Ling Qinglan were both the think tanks of the princes. Because of this, he hated Ling Qinglan very much. He hated Ling Qinglan even more than Ling Ping. Ling Ping moved one step and blocked Wu Jin's sight. He sneered and said, "You are hot-tempered because you see an annoying person. Master Wu is full of confidence. It seems that you are very confident about the autumn hunting. You flatter me. In terms of cultivation, I am not as good as second brother Ling. But I am a little bit luckier." Wu Jin grabbed the bag beside him and walked to the table. He poured out a lot of beast ears. The eunuchs who were counting were shocked and the crowd was in an uproar. So many. They are all beast ears of fierce beasts. There are also many 7-inch scales of big snakes. Someone couldn't help but take a deep breath and said, "The amount of beast ears was much more than everyone else. How did Wu Jin kill so many beasts in just 3 days?" The eunuchs quickly began to count and then announced, 18 pairs of large beast ears, 83 pairs of medium beast ears, 77 pairs of small beast ears. There are a total of 178 pairs. Nearly 200 pairs. It is close to 70% of the hunting ground. How is it possible? The crowd exclaimed and looked at Wu Jin with suspicion. It was hard to believe that one person accounted for 70% of the hunting ground. Wu Jin glanced at Ling Ping's expressionless face. He shrugged and said, "Second brother Ling, I am lucky. I picked up a sack of beast ears in the forest by chance. Although it is unfair to second brother Ling, the rules of the autumn hunting contest say that all the beast ears with the big tactical matrix mark are counted. I don't violate the rules, right? Eunuch Feng? Eunuch Feng was called and stood up. He replied with a smile, of course. What Mr. Wu said is right. The princes who had returned to the high platform and changed their clothes had different expressions when they saw this scene. The first Prince Dongfang Sheng and the third Prince Dongfang Lang raised their eyebrows at the same time. Wu Jin was so capable that he could even cheat in the autumn hunting contest. And it was so flawless that Eunuch Feng couldn't find a reason to refute. The fifth Prince Dongfang Yang smiled lightly. It seemed that he was not very interested in Wu Jin. As for the seventh Prince Dongfang Wuxue, he had fallen asleep in his seat. Clap, clap, clap. When Wu Jin thought that he was going to win, Ling Ping suddenly clapped his hands and said with a smile, Master Wu, you are really lucky. You can find so many beast ears. But I am also lucky. Let's have a competition. Let's see who can pick up more beast ears. What do you think? While speaking, Ling Ping picked up the sack with one hand and poured the beast ears on the ground. The beast ears piled up were no less than Wu Jin's. There was a burst of exclamation at the scene. Everyone looked at Wu Jin strangely. The total number of the beast ears of the two of them had far exceeded the number of the beasts raised in the hunting ground. One of them must have cheated. Ling Ping's cultivation seemed to be higher than Wu Jin's. Everyone naturally thought that Wu Jin cheated. And it was true. Wu Jin's face became very gloomy. He had prepared for almost half a year before he asked the tactical matrix master to simulate the big tactical matrix mark. The day before the opening of the hunting ground, he asked people to bury the beast ears in a specific place. But he didn't expect that Ling Ping could also hunt so many beast ears. How could it be possible? The best normal record in previous years was no more than 150 pairs. What method did Ling Ping use to hunt the beast ears? He wouldn't believe that the dignified Ling family would choose the same way as him to cheat. What's more, the Ling family didn't have a tactical matrix master. The only possibility was that these beast ears were really hunted by Ling Ping one by one. So, the problem came back to the original point. When Wu Jin was puzzled, the eunuch finally announced the result of Ling Ping's hunting. 38 pairs of large beast ears. 120 pairs of medium beast ears, 45 pairs of small beast ears. A total of 203 pairs. Boom. The crowd burst into cheers. Some people even began to shout General Ling is invincible. The shouts swept the whole place like a tide. Wu Jin's face was gloomy. His expression changed a few times. Finally, he left from the special passage without saying a word. He was like a wounded wolf hiding and licking his wounds alone. Eunuch Feng managed to suppress the shouts and walked to the high platform to announce the result. He said, the champion of this autumn hunting contest is undoubtedly, it is General Ling Ping of the Ling family. 3 days later, the Baisho feast will be held in the name of General Ling Ping in the Shunwu Square in Yunjing. I hope you can come on time. Ling Ping stood on the high platform and took 3 rewards. He held them high. Wow. Chapter 183. When Ling Ping and Ling Qinglan returned to the seats of the Ling family, they received congratulations from the 2 women of the Ling family. Ping, well done. You didn't disgrace the Ling family. Mrs. Ji Yu was very comforted. Chiu Meng was so excited that she burst into tears and held Ling Ping's arm tightly. Ling Ping grinned and didn't mention the assassination. Instead, he walked to Ling Li and through the branch of the dead tree he just got to Ling Li without saying anything. Ling Li stared at the thing in his hand and couldn't help but ask, "Second brother, don't you ask what this branch is for?" Ling Ping laughed and said, "If younger brother Li wants it, I will give it to you. If you want to tell me, you will tell me. If you don't want to tell me, I won't ask. You and Qinglan have grown up." Ling Li was moved, and there was an impulse in his heart. He wanted to show everything he had secretly planned in these years. But before the impulse turned into action, Ling Ping's head was knocked by Mrs. Ji Yu on the head. Mrs. Gu's words, boy, don't be complacent when you get the first prize. You are only 21 years old, which is the age to make progress. Don't talk like an old man. Ling Ping smiled embarrassedly. He didn't dare to argue with his grandma. He said, Grandma, let's go home. There must be a traffic jam if we don't leave early. You boy, Mrs. Gu scolded him with a smile and went back with the help of Chiu Meng. She was so happy that her grandson got the first prize. She walked briskly. Second brother Ling, you are really a role model of our generation. Tang Lei was also infected by the atmosphere. He kept flattering Ling Ping while walking behind. Su Li walked aside with a faint smile. In this way, it was worthwhile for her to go there. The carriage was sent to the affiliated school of the National Academy, and Su Li got off. Li, if you have time, you can come to the Ling house to chat with me. I heard that you are also good at cooking. I want to ask you for advice. Chiu Meng held Su Li's hand and didn't want to let go. Su Li smiled gently and said, Aunt Meng, you are welcome. I will come to bother you when I have time. Su Li was helpless. Chiu Meng asked her to call her Aunt Meng. She knew clearly what this woman wanted to do. But she had no reason to refuse. During this autumn hunt, he did not see anyone from Prime Minister Tang's residence. Instead, he got closer to the Ling residence. However, to be able to obtain a branch of the life and death tree was a pleasant surprise. As for the separation pill, Su Li frowned and turned into the affiliated school. The medicinal materials left by her senior fellow apprentice would be used up. The people of the Enmore cult would really make trouble for her. Ling Mansion. Ling Li slowly took the branch of the Kurong tree and returned to the courtyard. Ling Mo and Ling Xian had been waiting there for a long time. Seeing Ling Li frowning, they looked at each other and immediately went forward to push the wheelchair. Young master, what is this? Ling Mo couldn't help but ask when he saw the thing in Ling Li's hand. He looked at it carefully and his expression changed immediately. Master, is it? That's right, this is the branch of the Kurong tree. Ling Li replied and put the branch on the table. He was shocked. The 9 silver needles that were inserted in his waist immediately flew out and nailed to the wall. Hiss, standing up reluctantly, Ling Li took a light breath. His legs were so numb. It felt so good. Master, your cultivation is very high now. You don't need to rely on acupuncture to maintain the illusion. Why do you ask for trouble? Ling Mo held back his laughter and couldn't help but persuade him. Before Ling Li reached the inborn realm, he used acupuncture to cut off the tendons and vessels, which made those doctors think that his legs were really disabled. It was convenient to use acupuncture, but if it lasted for more than 7 days, his legs would really be disabled. Now Ling Li's cultivation reached the peak of the inborn realm. Although he wouldn't be disabled because of the 9 needles, the numbness in his legs caused by the obstruction of tendons and vessels was inevitable. He tried to stand up for a while and ran the genuine energy. The numbness faded quickly. Ling Li shook his head and said, Caution is the parent of safety. I still have to do what I should do. The reward of this year's autumn hunting contest is this thing. Second brother Ling won the first prize, so I asked for it. Ling Xian was surprised. She frowned and said, So coincidental. Is it possible that the Dongfang family deliberately sounds us out? I have thought about it. But if the Kurong tree is exposed. Ling Li took a deep breath and said with cold eyes, then the cult needs to be cleaned. Ling Xian and Ling Mo were shocked. The last time the Enmore cult was cleaned was when Ling Li took over the cult. And Ling Qinglan, Ling Xian, go and find out what he is up to. Ling Qinglan said. Ling Xian saluted and said, Yes, master. At the same time, Ling Qinglan and Ling Ping came to Ling Ping's yard together. They looked at each other and laughed at the same time. They were very happy. If you survive a disaster, you will have good fortune later. Ling Ping patted Ling Qinglan's thin shoulder heavily and called him like Ling Li. He said, Brother Lan, don't worry. Go and see Mr. Li. He must have a way to cure you. Ling Qinglan didn't have much hope in his heart, but he still smiled and said, Thank you, second brother. It was easy to see the true feelings at the moment of life and death. Although Ling Qinglan was good to his grandmother and mother, he didn't know his true feelings. Ling Li had little contact with Ling Qinglan. His impression of Ling Qinglan was just a dull and weak cousin who was not very good. But today's experience obviously made him see Ling Qinglan clearly. He knew that Ling Qinglan was really a good brother who deserved to entrust his life. By the way, take these things. Ling Ping suddenly thought of something and gave Hong Yuan's sword and the booklet to Ling Qinglan. He said, "If Mr. Li didn't help me this time, I couldn't get the first prize. You give these two things to Mr. Li." The Ling family was upright all their lives. They didn't want to take advantage of others. Ling Ping's action was also expected by Ling Qinglan. He smiled and put away the two things. He didn't see what was in the booklet either. He said, "Second brother, I will take them." "Good. You are tired today. Why don't you have a rest here?" Ling Ping proposed. Ling Qinglan remembered that he didn't care about Su Qingtan for 3 days. He quickly waved his hand and said, "No, I still have a lot of things to deal with in the Supreme Judiciary. I have to go back quickly. I will come to stay for a while another day. In this case, I won't keep you." Ling Ping nodded and looked at the direction where Ling Qinglan left quickly. Ling Qinglan didn't talk to Brother Li. He asked Ling Ping to say sorry to Brother Li before. He couldn't help but scratch his head and said to himself, when did the two silly boys quarrel? Ling Qinglan didn't go to Ling Li's yard because he didn't dare. Su Qingtan's current state was like a broken porcelain. He depended on the elixir given by Mr. Li to maintain his state. If Ling Li saw something, he was not sure whether Ling Li would kill Su Qingtan with a sword in a rage. After hurrying back to the Supreme Judiciary, Ling Qinglan checked the traces of the tactical matrix left. He found that no one had touched it. Su Qingtan was still in meditation, but the ice in the adatum had partly melted. Ling Qinglan rearranged the adatum with the ice toxin. He immediately breathed a sigh of relief. He changed into clean clothes and found the bloody thin paper in the dirty clothes. He burned it to ashes. A faint expectation flashed in his eyes. If he could survive, who would want to die? Ling Qinglan didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, he disguised himself with a pair of dark circles and went to the address written on the thin paper alone. There were few pedestrians in the morning. Occasionally, he could see 1 or 2 pedestrians. When he walked to the alley on the thin paper, he couldn't see anyone. It was not even 5 o'clock in the morning. It was really too early. Ling Qinglan smiled bitterly. Suddenly, he saw a high-rise building protruding from the bungalow. The Linli building. There was also the Linli building in Yunjing City. Ling Qinglan was surprised. The Tianya house didn't find this place because the alley here was too remote. In addition, the Linli building didn't deliberately publicize it. It was far less famous than in Qinghe province. Standing at the door of the Linli building, Ling Qinglan hesitated for a moment and knocked on the door. Unexpectedly, the door was opened with a squeak. An ordinary waiter opened the door. Ling Qinglan didn't see any trace of disguise. It seemed that the Linli building in Yunjing City was different from the one in Qinghe town. At least this waiter didn't really belong to the Linli building. "Guest, come in. The shopkeeper has told you. There will be a guest coming this morning. You can go directly to the top floor." "Thank you." Ling Qinglan nodded and thanked. The waiter was immediately flattered. It was strange that a child dressed so luxuriously would thank him, a lowly person. On the way upstairs, Ling Qinglan didn't see anyone. But it was not the business time now. It was normal that there was no one. Looking around, he immediately saw the extremely eye-catching wooden sign for wine. The price on it made him inwardly suck in a breath of cold air. The wine not only increased in price, but also greatly. A bottle of wine cost 100,000 taels. No matter how much of a wine lover he was, he wouldn't buy it, right? Even if he had money, he wouldn't spend it like this. When he went up to the top floor, Ling Qinglan still saw the pavilion with the 4 windows open. The layout was exactly the same as that in Qinghe province. In the early morning, the cold wind was blowing. The cold poison in Ling Qinglan's body was affected. He looked weak and pale. But at this time, a pot of wine suddenly appeared in front of him. The voice of Mr. Li sounded at the right time, "Drink it." Ling Qinglan looked up and found that Su Li appeared at the table. At this moment, his impression of Su Li was different. The first time they met in Qinghe province, he was frightened and mysterious. The second time they met, in the Supreme Judiciary, Mr. Li was more mysterious and profound in his mind. The third time, in the Northwest hunting ground, Mr. Li appeared out of nowhere and killed everything. While he admired Mr. Li, he also had a sense of closeness to Mr. Li. It seemed that the mysterious Mr. Li was not a mysterious guest who looked on indifferently, but he was vaguely paying attention to them and helping them. With a smile, Ling Qinglan raised his head and drank a mouthful of wine. He didn't worry about whether the wine was poisonous or not. But the spiciness of the wine was far beyond his imagination, and he immediately coughed violently. Ha ha ha, Su Li's hearty laughter echoed in the pavilion. Ling Qinglan coughed and smiled embarrassedly. He really lost face in front of Mr. Li. What? Soon, he found that when the wine entered his stomach, a warm feeling rose and suppressed the cold poison in his body. In terms of speed, it was not much slower than the elixirs he took. The wine had such an effect. Ling Qinglan was amazed in his heart. Su Li's teasing voice came to his ears. This wine is the original pulp of the Liehua spirits. Its value is more than 50,000 taels. By the way, are you going to stand and chat with me all the time? Ling Qinglan suddenly woke up and sat a little cautiously opposite Su Li. He had been the deputy hierarch of the Enmore cult for nearly 10 years, but at this moment, he felt restrained in front of Su Li. Mr. Li, please accept these two things. Ling Qinglan took out the Hongyuan sword and the ancient booklet and put them on the table. Second brother Ling and I both think that these two things should belong to Mr. Li. As for the branch of the dead tree, it was taken by the hierarch. Please forgive us, Mr. Li, it doesn't matter. Give me your hand. I'll see how many days you can live. Su Li didn't seem to care. She knocked on the table. Ling Qinglan stretched out his wrist obediently. He couldn't be more obedient. Even in front of Ling Li, he never showed such a well-behaved expression. Chapter 184. In the quiet attic, the more Su Li diagnosed, the more she frowned. Finally, she couldn't help but laugh angrily. Well, Lord Ling, you really don't care about your life. Now your body depends on the elixir I gave you. When the efficacy of the elixir disappears, I'm afraid that you will immediately vomit blood and die. Ling Qinglan scratched his head embarrassedly. He was ready to die at any time. At this moment, when he heard Su Li's words, he was not flustered. Instead, he smiled and said, Mr. Li, you have foreseen this, so you specially arranged the waiter to wait for me. Su Li stared at Ling Qinglan angrily. She pointed at the major acupoints all over Ling Qinglan's body with her fingers. She grasped the air with her 5 fingers. Wood starlight immediately penetrated into Ling Qinglan's body from the acupoints. The amount of starlight was several times more than that she treated Qiu Meng last time. The thread-like wood starlight seemed to be far different from the one used to treat Qiu Meng that day. Ling Qinglan did not recognize it. At this moment, he was shocked by the earth-shaking changes in his body. When his body encountered the green energy, it was like a good rain after a long drought. After the baptism of the green energy, his internal organs which had been eroded by the cold poison for a long time were immediately refreshed and revitalized. He could feel that his body recovered to the strong period at a very fast speed. The loss caused by the abuse of the cold poison was actually made up at once. At this moment, Su Li shouted softly, "Open your mouth." Ling Qinglan immediately opened his mouth. A pitch-black elixir went into his body along his throat. Then a strange itch began to spread from his throat. It's so itchy. Ling Qinglan, who had endured the cold poison for many years, couldn't help but groan because of the strange itch. He couldn't help but open his clothes and grab the elixir that was getting deeper and deeper. Ling Qinglan was stunned by what he saw. The elixir in his abdomen was reflected on the surface of his skin and became a black spot. It was radiating along the tendons and vessels. In the blink of an eye, his hands and legs were covered with strange black lines. The strange itch spread to the bone marrow of his body. Ah 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 ah. The surging strange itch was like thousands of ants gnawing his bones. Ling Qinglan rolled from the stool to the ground in embarrassment. He curled up into a ball and kept groaning. What is this elixir? Seeing Ling Qinglan's bloodshot eyes, Su Li sighed and said, the antidote of the Lijue pill. Ling Qinglan's eyes widened in shock. The separation pill actually had an antidote? He wanted to ask more questions, but he soon discovered that not only could he not speak, but he also could not even scratch his itch. His entire body was completely paralyzed. It was the effect of the black line. When Ling Qinglan thought of this, he could only divert his attention to distract himself from the pain. Fortunately, at this time, Su Li said again, the effect of separation of unconventional elixir is amazing. No matter how serious the injury is or how powerful the poison is, it can keep him alive for 100 days. But after 100 days, he will definitely die. There was no cure. Ling Qinglan, this is what you heard, right? Ling Qinglan's eyes were full of affirmation. He heard the rumor, so he took the elixir with the determination to die. Su Li shook her head and laughed. Do you know what is used to refine the Lijue pill? Where did it come from? Why does such an amazing elixir flow into the secular world? Ling Qinglan was suffering hell-like torture at the moment, but Su Li's words were really attractive. He forced himself to continue listening with curiosity. Let me tell you, the separation pill. The Lijue pill is refined from living people. The living people are burned to death by fire, and then their desperate hearts are taken. There are a total of 49 hearts and they are refined into a blood-red elixir. Besides, there is nothing else. Ling Qinglan's pupils shrank instantly. That was to say, what he ate was not an elixir, but human flesh. He immediately had a feeling of nausea, but now his whole body was imprisoned, so he couldn't do it. At this moment, Su Li continued to say, the refining method is a secret. Except for the elders of the Lianxia cult who refine corpse puppets for fun, no one else knows it. Those who have taken the Lijue pill can indeed exchange for a period of time, but the specific number of days depends on the person. Do you want to live for 100 days? It's a fool's talk. Seeing that Ms. Li didn't forget to attack him at this time, Ling Qinglan couldn't help but smile bitterly. He didn't know whether Su Li's words really had the effect of distracting his attention. He seemed to feel that the strange itch in his body seemed to be a little weaker. It was not as challenging his nerve limit as before. Those who take the Lijue pill will usually be marked by the Lianxia cult in their bodies. They know that when you die, your body will immediately be taken back by the Lianxia cult and made into corpse puppet. Su Li's smile was a little creepy, and her words made Ling Qinglan's scalp numb. She said, because the Lijue pill has another name, which is the treasure corpse pill. Those who take the Lijue pill have a great chance to refine rarer corpse puppets after refining, which is the foundation of the Lianxia cult. Ling Qinglan retched. He had never felt so disgusted. He was actually schemed by the Lianxia cult from the beginning to the end. Although the Enmore cult was so powerful that it was no less than the Hehuan sect and the Lianxia cult, its foundation was still far behind. Well, can I speak with my mouth? Ling Qinglan suddenly found it and said with surprise. Su Li also smiled and said, it seems that the person who gave you the Lijue pill is not a particularly powerful elder of the Lianxia cult. Otherwise, the mark will not be so easy to eliminate. In the future, you should remember not to take the elixir given by strangers. Ling Qinglan was ashamed and bowed his head. I will remember. He thought that the elder was a hermit, but it turned out that the elder took a fancy to his physical body. At this time, he suddenly felt that the top of his head was gently touched by Su Li, and then he heard Su Li said, the mark has dissipated. The people of the Lianxia cult can't control you, but your abnormality will definitely attract their attention. You should be careful recently. Then enjoy the detoxification process. Mr. Li, don't worry. This matter will not affect you. The Enmore cult is not a soft persimmon that can be pinched by others. Ling Qinglan said in a low voice, and then he realized the second half of Su Li's words. Detoxification? His poison hadn't been detoxified yet. Before he responded, Ling Qinglan felt a sharp pain suddenly spread from the bottom of his heart, and soon he couldn't speak because of the pain. When did I say that your poison has been detoxified? Su Li pressed Ling Qinglan's acupuncture point with one hand, so that he couldn't move. She said, "Lidua pill is a kind of corpse poison, which is extremely difficult to deal with. You have swallowed the Lidua pill for more than 10 days. The corpse poison has penetrated deep into the bone marrow. It is not easy to remove all of it." After explaining, Su Li sighed and said, "The paralysis can only make you endure the extreme itch. If you want to endure the real outbreak, you still have to rely on your own will. In order not to let you bite off your tongue, I pressed your acupuncture point. Ling Qinglan, the pain is actually much easier to endure than the extreme itch. I will come to refresh you every 2 hours. You must not fall asleep. In order to detoxify you, I have lost most of my wealth, and I can't afford the second antidote. If you really want to live, stick to it." Hearing the last sentence, Ling Qinglan's eyes showed unprecedented firmness. He was like a drowning man who suddenly saw a rope after a long time. Even if it was a fragile straw rope, he would not hesitate to grasp it. Live. He had been longing for these 2 words for a long time. Seeing Ling Qinglan's eyes, Su Li finally breathed a sigh of relief. She was not sure how strong Ling Qinglan's will to live was. Fortunately, this guy seemed to have seen hope, and there was a great chance that he could survive the torture of this day and night. After that, Su Li came to feed Ling Qinglan an elixir to nourish his mind every 2 hours, so that Ling Qinglan wouldn't have a nervous breakdown. But Ling Qinglan still felt that every minute and second was very difficult. The boundless pain made him numb, but he had to keep the pain clear so that he wouldn't fall asleep. It was just a day and a night, but in Ling Qinglan's cognition, it seemed that he had spent tens of thousands of years. When the morning light appeared on the horizon the next day, the pain all over his body faded like the tide. He relaxed and lay flat on the ground, watching the rising sun in the sky. He never felt that the morning sun could be so beautiful and spectacular. Standing up reluctantly, Ling Qinglan looked at his wrinkled clothes and a thick layer of sweat on the ground. He smiled bitterly for a moment, and finally relaxed. The haze brought by the Lidua pill finally passed. If he saw the old man again in the future, he would definitely use the power of the Sholu cult to torture the old man half to death. Tap 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 tap, familiar footsteps came from behind. Ling Qinglan turned around and saw Su Li. There was a trace of exhaustion on her face. He couldn't help but feel ashamed. He quickly stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Ms. Li, I can't repay you this time. If you need any help in the future, I'm at your disposal." Su Li tilted her head and smiled. She said meaningfully, "Well, I accept your promise. Now you have recovered to the state before you took the Lidua pill, and your physical condition is good. Now go back to your hierarch. He should have a way to solve the cold poison now." Ling Qinglan remembered that Su Li only helped him solve the sequela of the Lidua pill, and the cold poison also threatened his life. But he still didn't understand what Su Li said. Ling Li has a way to deal with the cold poison. Ling Qinglan didn't believe it, but what Su Li said didn't seem to be false. If I guess right, that branch is the rare treasure in the fire, the branch of the kurong tree. This thing can naturally restrain the cold poison. If it is used properly, the cold poison in your body will not be a big problem. Su Li said with a teasing smile, "And I also heard that your hierarch and the little girl of the Su family have an agreement. As long as you find the branch of the kurong tree, the little girl of the Su family will cure you. You can rest assured." Ling Qinglan was stunned for a long time when he heard that. It turned out that the branch that Ling Li had been looking for was the treasure to dispel the cold poison for him. Why did Ling Li do things in secret like him? If Ling Li had said it earlier, how could he swallow such a terrible elixir as the Lidua pill? For a moment, Ling Qinglan was angry and amused, but he was more ashamed. During this time, he misunderstood Ling Li. He clearly knew that Ling Li was not a selfish person, and it was impossible for him to take advantage of his dying body. But at that time, he was blinded by the heavy shadow, and he didn't see it clearly. So, he made a stupid thing. Suddenly, he thought of something and hesitated to say, "Master, if I detoxify the cold poison, what about Su Qingtan?" Su Li smiled when she heard that. If Ling Qinglan didn't ask this question, she wouldn't cure him. "Don't worry. I will explain the rest to the little girl Su Li. Anyway, I am her kindred spirit and a fellow from the same hometown. She will listen to my advice. Hearing Su Li's guarantee, Ling Qinglan finally put down the burden completely. After thanking her several times, he bought 2 pots of first-class Liehua spirits and left the Linli building with satisfaction. He completely forgot that he would never buy wine when he just entered the Linli building. It was a sunny day again. Ling Qinglan raised his head and drank a mouthful of wine. The spiciness went into his throat. He laughed and stepped away from the remote alley. After just 1 day and 1 night, the trajectory of his fate had been completely different. Xian Jingju, who looked greedy, poked his head out of the Juyu winery and couldn't help licking his lips. Chapter 185. In the study of the Ling mansion, Ling Mo suddenly came in and reported, "Master, Ling Qinglan is here." Ling Li stopped writing and threw the file aside. He raised his eyebrows and said angrily, "I just sent Ling Xian to investigate him, and this guy comes to me. Does he want to ruin my plan?" Thinking of this, Ling Qinglan pushed the door and came in with a smile on his face, which was quite different from the usual smile that kept people thousands of miles away. Ling Li was slightly stunned. Ling Qinglan seemed to be different. But he couldn't tell what was different. Ling Qinglan sat down in front of Ling Li. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "I'm sorry." Ling Li felt more strange and said with a faint smile, "It's not in line with your character to apologize immediately. What have you done recently? Tell me." Ling Qinglan appeared here, which meant that he was ready to show his cards. Hearing that, Ling Qinglan took a deep breath as expected. Every word he said was earth-shattering. "I gave Su Qingtan Qiyu Shengong." What? Ling Mo was guarding at the door. He was slightly shocked and looked at Ling Qinglan with an unbelievable look. Did he want Su Qingtan to die? Ling Li tightened his lips and looked gloomy. "Do you know that ordinary people will die if they practice it? Even Ling Mo couldn't control himself in those years. I forced him to lose 3 years of hard practice for no reason." Ling Li took a deep breath and suppressed his anger. He asked, "How long has Su Qingtan practiced?" He didn't care about other people's lives, but Su Qingtan, Su Li's eldest brother. If Su Qingtan died, he didn't know what the eccentric girl would do. Ling Qinglan heard the question and smiled. "More than 13 days. Su Qingtan has reached the acquired 7th hurdle and is clear-minded." Hearing that, Ling Li's anger suddenly stagnated. 13 days. He reached the acquired 7th hurdle from no cultivation. That was to say, Su Qingtan didn't lose his mind. Instead, he passed the most dangerous stage safely. Ling Li didn't understand. He had seen Su Qingtan before. Except for his handsome face, his route was ordinary. There was nothing special about him. How could such a person have a fate with Qiyu Shengong? He didn't believe it. At this moment, Ling Qinglan suddenly said the reason in one breath. "I used the ice poison to help him suppress it." Every minute and second, he was extremely calm and had no desire. Qiyu Shengong practiced to the 2nd inborn hurdle of the Qiyu Shengong. It was a peerless martial art without drawbacks. From now on, our sect will have another peerless expert. Crash. Ling Li was shocked and angry. He suddenly stood up and grabbed Ling Qinglan's wrist. The files on the table were scattered on the ground. He roared in a low voice, "Are you crazy? I worked so hard to help you break through to the Xiantian realm and suppress the cold poison, but you can't wait to die." Ling Li was like a furious king at the moment. His momentum rolled back in the room and made his sleeves flutter. But Ling Qinglan grinned. It was said that Ling Li was cold-blooded and selfish. He valued everything, including people, in Jianghu. As for Ling Li, he tried his best to pretend to be heartless. But no matter how he pretended, he couldn't deceive everyone, just like now. Thump, thump, thump. Ling Li was stunned when he felt the strong pulse in his hand. It was not like the tendons and vessels eroded by the cold poison at all. "Are you kidding me?" Ling Li raised his eyebrows and calmed down instantly. He sat back in the wheelchair and crossed his hands. He said, "I can see that you are deliberately looking for trouble today. Go on." Ling Qinglan sat upright and said seriously, "What I said today is true. Su Qingtan is still in the Supreme Judiciary. In order to help him, I took the Lijue pill. Ling Li clenched his hands tightly, but he didn't say much this time. He could see that Ling Qinglan hadn't finished his words. No matter how complicated his heart was now, he was going to settle the score with Ling Qinglan at the end. Ling Mo's eyes darkened slightly. The name of the Lijue pill could tell that it was not a good elixir. The Lijue pill can keep you alive for 100 days. But you will die after 100 days. I exchanged this elixir for enough time to arrange a perfect practice environment for Su Qingtan. But man proposes, God disposes. The effect of the Lijue pill only lasted for 13 days. Ling Li loosened his hands and curled his lips. It had been more than 13 days today, but this guy was still alive. Could it be that the Lijue pill is fake? Ling Mo couldn't help but frown and ask. If a fake medicine that would not kill people could extend their lives for 13 days without sequelae, it was a miraculous medicine. No. The Lijue pill is real. Ling Qinglan thought of the scene on the hunting ground that day. He was afraid and said, after taking the Lijue pill, I tried not to fight with others. But on the third day of the autumn hunting, the pear blossom yin-yang fan was destroyed. Destroyed? Ling Li's pupils shrank slightly. No wonder he didn't come here with the fan today. The life-saving weapon was destroyed. What on earth did Ling Qinglan experience in the hunting ground? 8 seniors of the inborn realm set up a tactical matrix to kill us. Ling Qinglan's tone became cold and severe. He said, second brother Ling and I were not even qualified to die together. The level of the trap matrix was far beyond my ability. I could only exchange the yin-yang fan for 10 minutes. Finally, I detonated the needle base to help second brother Ling survive. But in the end, Ling Qinglan smiled bitterly and said, not to mention a way out, there was not even a crack in the tactical matrix. Second brother Ling and I could only wait for death. What happened then? It seemed that Ling Mo could imagine how desperate Ling Qinglan and Ling Ping were at that time. He couldn't help but ask nervously. Ling Li's eyes were full of coldness. The second brother didn't mention it to him. If Ling Qinglan didn't say it, he would have been kept in the dark. Later, a young man in plain clothes who seemed to be about the same age as Ling Li appeared. Ling Qinglan stared at Ling Li's surprised eyes and said word by word, he broke the tactical matrix by himself and killed 3 people in a breath. The remaining 5 people fled in a panic, but they were all killed by him with a very strange skill of controlling things. We survived inexplicably. Ling Mo was gradually shocked. A young man who was about the same age as his master killed 8 seniors of the inborn realm as easily as cutting melons and vegetables. There was someone who could compete with his master in this world. Who is he? Ling Li frowned and various thoughts appeared in his mind. He said, according to what you said, the Ling family owes that young man 2 lives. It is difficult to pay off this kindness. If he wants to repay the kindness, I know what you want to say. Listen to me first. Ling Qinglan interrupted Ling Li and continued, I have seen that young man before. He called himself Mr. Li. His whereabouts were erratic. Few people know his real face. Even now, I don't know whether what I saw was his real face. Then Ling Qinglan told Ling Li that he went to the Linli building to keep the appointment. Ling Li became more silent. Was there really a person in the world who did things without asking for repayment? He was very doubtful, but he couldn't refute what Ling Qinglan said. Ling Qinglan clearly knew the details of all of them and the situation in Yunjing. He saved the Ling family from danger continuously and deliberately left the beast ears to help second brother Ling win the first prize. But he never stood up to ask for anything. This person was really weird. He would never think that the so-called Mr. Li and Su Li would be the same person. The young man that Ling Qinglan said made him preconceived. He had already determined that Mr. Li was a mysterious peer whose cultivation and temperament were unfathomable. Mr. Li also said that there was an agreement between you and Su Li. When Ling Qinglan said this, he looked a little ashamed. He said, it's my fault. If I can firmly believe in you, I won't eat the Lijue pill. No, it's my fault. Ling Li said in a low voice. His tone was sincere and complicated. He said, you don't need to say more. If I had made it clear earlier, the misunderstanding would not have happened. Ling Qinglan heard it and smiled gently. He said, That's good. You have your fault, and I have mine. Since the matter has passed, it's better to let it go. After all, I have to continue to be a Qinghu. Hierarch and deputy hierarch can't have a conflict. Seeing that Ling Qinglan said this gracefully, the last discomfort in Ling Li's heart was completely erased. He couldn't help but laugh and scold, "You are a good person. How can I, the hierarch, feel ashamed?" Ha ha ha, there was a burst of cheerful laughter in the room. After laughing, Ling Li suddenly thought of something and said strangely, "You said that Mr. Li asked me to find Su Li to fulfill the promise?" Ling Qinglan was slightly stunned. He said, "Yes, the Kurong tree has been obtained." "Is it?" Ling Li scratched his head and said, "Does he have any misunderstanding about the agreement between me and Su Li?" "What?" Ling Qinglan was confused. Ling Mo interrupted at this moment, "The agreement between you and Su Li is that you must get the full moon and heartstrings and the branch of the Kurong tree. Then Su Li will promise to cure you." Ling Qinglan was completely dumbfounded when he heard it. It turned out that even Ling Li's ambition for the full moon and heartstrings was also because of the agreement with Su Li. But do you want to say that Su Li looks kind-hearted and innocent? She won't make such a request at all? Ling Li said quietly and gnashed his teeth. He said, "Don't be deceived by her weak appearance. In fact, she is not only ruthless, but also never soft-hearted when she cheats people." Ling Qinglan was really dumbfounded when he heard it. He had met Su Li many times, especially in the carriage. Su Li's performance could be said to be the standard dream of all men in the world. How could she be cruel and merciless as Ling Li said? But Ling Li said so. It could only be said that Su Li's acting skills were far beyond his ability to see through. When he thought that he needed Su Li to detoxify the cold poison in his body, he couldn't help but feel nervous. Chapter 186. Seeing Ling Li's action, Ling Qinglan was more confused. Ling Li was going to suffer a loss. Why did he show an impatient look? Ling Qinglan raised his eyebrows and went out. He grabbed Ling Mo, who was about to leave, and asked in a low voice, "What is the relationship between Ling Li and Su Li?" "I don't know," Ling Mo answered expressionlessly. Ling Qinglan was instantly disappointed. Unexpectedly, Ling Mo turned around and walked a few steps. Then he came back and whispered, "But Miss Su saved my life and my master's life. Master owes Miss Su more." "I see." Ling Qinglan responded meaningfully. He finally understood why Ling Li didn't think of revenge even though he was deceived by Su Li. "Ling Mo, hurry up." An angry voice came from the room. Ling Mo's face trembled. He quickly left, but there was a smile on his face. The affiliated school of the National Academy. Su Li played the sound acquaintance poisonous insect in her hand. She held her chin with her left hand and was in a daze. She used up most of the rare medicinal materials in the underground additum to refine the antidote of the Lijua pill. The medicinal materials reserve was greatly damaged. She didn't know when she could collect so many precious medicines again. She had to use them sparingly in the future. During this time, her cultivation advanced by leaps and bounds. She relied on the complete medicinal materials left by her senior fellow apprentice. The auxiliary medicines she refined were all high-grade. In just a few months, she had reached the inborn 7th hurdle, although it was far from the extreme 9th hurdle of the inborn hurdle. But with the help of the AO sword skills, her explosive power was no less than that of the inborn 9th hurdle. The only drawback was that if she used the AO sword skills, her endurance was too poor. She could only launch the attack that killed the 8 inborn hurdles 3 times with the support of genuine energy. But even so, Su Li was very satisfied. Because the fighting capacity of the inborn 9th hurdle was enough for her to stand firm in Yunjing City. Swish. At this moment, Su Li's expression suddenly changed slightly. Immediately, a black shadow flashed into the room. Su Li saw that it was a middle-aged man with an ordinary face, but his cultivation reached the inborn hurdle. When the middle-aged man saw Su Li, he knelt on the ground and respectfully presented an invitation. Su Li looked at his dress, and a faint golden light flashed in her eyes. They were from the slaughter tower. The assassins of the Shalating Tower looked inconspicuous on the surface, making it difficult for others to identify them. However, there was one thing that was easy to identify. Her husband in her previous life had once said that every assassin of the Shalating Tower would have an inconspicuous mark on their ears, which could only be seen by the Shalating Tower's unique eye sorcery. Thinking of this, Su Li stretched out her hand, and the invitation fell into her hand. Without any nonsense, the middle-aged man immediately turned into a black shadow and disappeared in the room. To be on the safe side, Su Li came to the underground adytum and opened the envelope. A map and a token fell out. She opened the map and found that there were marks on it. This was the whole picture of Yunjing City, and the marked place was a whole street. Su Li raised her eyebrows. Didn't he ask her to treat Ling Qinglan? What was he trying to do? Turning to the back of the map, she finally saw Ling Li's handwriting. I have something to discuss with you. See you on the street in the evening. Su Li burned the letter into ashes. There was light in her eyes. She wanted to see what Ling Li was going to do this time. In the twinkling of an eye, the sun went down. The red clouds in the west in the evening were like a fire burning through half of the sky, gilding people with a layer of gold. Su Li's plain white dress turned golden red. She walked slowly on the nameless street. Her long hair was like a golden waterfall, which made her quite charming. This was a street that looked ordinary. The evening market was noisy, and there were ordinary people coming and going. Among them, there was a teenager with a jadebone mask. He stood beside the street vendor and looked at Su Li quietly. He had been waiting for her for a long time. Looking through the crowd, Su Li smiled. She thought of the time when she saw Ling Li for the first time in her life. However, even if he was destined to be with her, what could he do? Su Li's smile faded a little. She walked to Ling Li and said in a flat voice, "Hierarch, aren't you afraid of being discovered by the people of Dahan country?" He grinned under the jadebone mask and said calmly, "Miss Su, do you know where this place is?" Su Li raised her eyebrows and replied without showing weakness, "I'd like to hear the details." So, the teenager with the jadebone mask suddenly grabbed Su Li's hand. In the astonished eyes of the pedestrians around, they suddenly broke into the turbulent crowd. They became more eye-catching. When their skin touched, Su Li's fingertips trembled slightly. She was angry and said unbelievably, "Are you crazy?" Ling Li didn't panic. Instead, he laughed recklessly and asked, "Miss Su, do you know the meaning of the so-called Great Hermit in the city?" "What?" Before she thought carefully, Su Li had been pulled to the busiest middle of the street in the blink of an eye. There were acrobats, tea vendors, and sugar figurines. Ling Li took a sugar figurine from the vendor and sent it to Su Li. Su Li frowned and didn't ask. Then she heard the craftsman suddenly stood up and saluted to Ling Li, "Hierarch." Then, the craftsman began to sell sugar figurines, as if the greeting just now was just an ordinary greeting. Then, the butcher put down the knife in his hand and laughed, "Hierarch." The acrobat jumped down from the high place and saluted respectfully with the monkey in his hand. "Hierarch." The scholars and booksellers who passed by the bookstall put down the books in their hands at the same time and turned around to salute. "Hierarch." Even the passers-by on the roadside would stop immediately and turn back to say, "Hierarch, hierarch, hierarch, hierarch." The face of the teenager with the jadebone mask showed an evil smile. "You ask me whether I am afraid or not. Have you ever seen a master who goes home afraid? This place, is this sect master's territory?" The maple leaves on both sides of the street fell like red butterflies. Su Li took a deep breath and almost forgot to breathe at this moment. At this time, Ling Li exuded a high spirit, which was the dazzling light she had never seen before. Following Ling Li to the deepest mansion in the street, Su Li calmed down and various thoughts came to her mind. Maureen, the headquarter of the Enmore cult, was actually hidden in a street in Yunjing City. She had heard that the headquarter of the Enmore cult was called Maureen in her previous life. But at that time, the Enmore cult had been destroyed and the headquarter was nowhere to be found. An inborn senior who could really live like an ordinary person. There were a large number of seniors in the headquarter of the Enmore cult who practiced the secular world doctrine. Their strength could not be underestimated. Although the secular world doctrine was difficult, if one had the talent, his Shengong would advance very quickly. For example, Xian Jingju and his wife were less than 40 years old, but they both reached the highest realm of the inborn realm. However, the core of the Enmore cult turned out to be a group of highly principled seniors of the secular world doctrine. It was really surprising. While thinking, Ling Li had taken off his mask and poured a cup of tea for Su Li. "Miss Su, please have some tea." Ling Li sat opposite to Su Li with his right hand. He was perturbed and didn't know what to say for a while. After all, the agreement between him and Su Li was very clear. Now he didn't get the full moon and heartstrings, but he wanted Su Li to treat Ling Qinglan first. It was really against the rules. At this time, Su Li suddenly said, "I have heard the details from Mr. Li. Since Ling Qinglan's body can't support the day of the auction, and the branch of the Kurong tree has been obtained, I reluctantly detoxify Ling Qinglan first," but Ling Li was relieved when he heard the words. Then he was worried when he heard the word "but." He knew that Su Li was not the one who would suffer losses at all. But what? Ling Qinglan couldn't help walking out of the inner room and asked in a deep voice, "Miss Su, I am the one who was poisoned. If you want to embarrass me, you can embarrass me." Su Li tilted her head and looked at Ling Qinglan. She stared at him and said, "You practiced such a strange practice method for my eldest brother. I haven't punished you yet. Do you want to help others?" Ling Qinglan's face suddenly turned green. Was the relationship between Su Li and Mr. Li so close? She even told him about Su Qingtan. But it was normal. If she didn't say it, there was no other reason to leave the ice poison for Su Qingtan to suppress the devil in his heart. After all, the ice poison was harmful. It could only restrain the Qiyu Shengong, which was also an evil martial art. Thinking of this, Ling Qinglan had to leave silently. He didn't want to make trouble for Ling Li. Ling Li asked with a black face, "What do you want this time?" He didn't hesitate to expose the headquarters in front of her and almost didn't treat her as an outsider. Why did she still speak coldly to him and ignore him? Did she think that he was angry because he mistook her for Ling Shui? Or last time, he accidentally kissed her? "Hierarch, do you remember that you owed me a favor on the way to the hunting ground a few days ago?" Su Li smiled like a little fox and said, "I know that you have a big family and a big business. You can't give me many things in return at once. So, you should remember that you owe me 2 favors now. At a certain time in the future, you should do 2 things for me unconditionally on the premise of not violating the doctrine of the Enmore cult. As long as you agree, I will immediately cure Ling Qinglan." It was this request again. Ling Li couldn't think of a reason to refute, but the scope of Su Li's request was too wide. It always made him feel that Su Li was planning something unspeakable. But now, it was more important to detoxify Ling Qinglan. "Miss Su, do you mean it?" "Of course. Well, deal. I owe Miss Su Li 2 requests in my life. If you don't make a request, I will remember it and never forget it." An hour later, Ling Li looked at Su Li, who held the ice crystal branch with a gloomy face. He couldn't believe it and said, "That's it." From the beginning to the end, Ling Li only saw Su Li take the branch of the Kurong tree and put it in the position of Ling Qinglan's pubic region. Then, there was no then. He felt that he suffered a great loss in doing business. If he had known that it was so easy to detoxify Ling Qinglan's cold poison, he wouldn't have invited Su Li to suffer a great loss. Ling Qinglan, who was between them, had no time to care about Ling Li's feelings. An hour later, he watched as ice crystals formed little by little on the withered branches. His eyes gradually became moist and he felt his body becoming more and more relaxed. He could clearly feel that the cold poison that had troubled him for more than 10 years was leaving him at an extremely fast speed. "Dad. Mom. I can live again. With your blessings in heaven, I will find out the real murderer of the unsettled case that year. Although I just put the branch on Ling Qinglan's abdomen lightly, you can't do it because it is about skills and secret methods. It can't be done without the genuine medical knowledge." Su Li was full of nonsense, which made Ling Li feel better. In fact, the preparation for the treatment of the cold poison had been completed in the Lin Li building. The last step was the Kurong tree branch. The energy and medicinal materials consumed from the beginning to the end were far beyond Ling Li's imagination. However, Su Li didn't say a word about it. Because in this life, she just wanted to stand in the dark and quietly watch Ling Li fulfill his wish. She didn't want to destroy the image of her husband in her heart. Even if she knew that she couldn't see the silly boy again, she didn't want him in this life, to become him in the previous life. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.